Chapter 160. Han Shaw immediately focused all of his attention as soon as he left the rear courtyard. Although he was carrying Lisa, Han Shaw's speed was still as fast as lightning. He flew at full speed as soon as he landed on the small path behind him. It was noon at this time, but there weren't many people on the streets even in broad daylight in such a cold winter. Add to that the fact that Valin City had been on high alert for the past 2 days, and the residents had mostly hidden themselves in their homes and refrained from going out. Han Shaw's figure was a bit of an eyesore as he dashed through the streets. 2 Griffin riders were on patrol in the sky, whistling through the air when they spotted Han Shaw's figure. The griffins screeched and the 2 Griffin riders flew in Han Shaw's direction with 3-meter-long javelins. There are griffins in the sky. Lisa, who was in Han Shaw's arms, had her face flushed red from the cold. When she raised her head to look at the sky, she discovered that the 2 Griffin knights were chasing each other. She hurriedly reminded Han Shaw. "I know, don't worry." Han Shaw had long since seen the 2 Griffin knights tailing him. His expression didn't change as he called out to Lisa in a low voice. His body continued to quickly weave through the chaotic streets as his mind raced for countermeasures. Han Shaw clearly remembered the places he'd passed by on his way to Lawrence. Now that he'd been targeted by the Griffin riders, Han Shaw quickly thought of a way to deal with them. The Dark Mantle stronghold couldn't be exposed, so he absolutely couldn't return to the Dark Mantle now. There were soldiers of the Griffin Legion patrolling every corner of Valin City. Now that the 2 Griffin riders in the sky had their eyes on him, he had to quickly shake them off or find a place to kill them. Otherwise, even greater trouble would befall him. As his thoughts raced, Han Shaw suddenly changed directions. He no longer used the terrain to weave through the houses, but instead ran in the direction of a patch of forest that he'd seen on his way here. Magical yuan circulated within Han Shaw's body, the surging power seemingly endless. Han Shaw's running speed far exceeded the expectations of the 2 Griffin knights. The 2 Griffin Legion riders had originally planned on lowering their griffins to kill Han Shaw as soon as he left the area with too many obstructions. Who would have thought that Han Shaw would be riding a sturdy, healthy horse after leaving the area? His swift speed caught the 2 Griffin Legion riders off guard. However, the griffins naturally had the advantage of flying in the sky. After the 2 Griffin riders steadied themselves, the 2 griffins finally caught up to Han Shaw. They kept a close eye on Han Shaw as he circled above the forest. This place was already a few miles away from where Lawrence was. Han Shaw had noticed that there were only 2 Griffin knights chasing after him, so he didn't appear to be flustered. When he entered the forest, Han Shaw's body immediately paused and he abruptly stopped. He tossed Lisa into the air and carried her on his back. "Hold on to me tightly, don't let go no matter what," Han Shaw instructed lowly. Nodding obediently on Han Shaw's back, Lisa said resolutely, "I understand. I won't let go of your hands even if I die. Don't worry, it won't be the 2 of us who will die." Han Shaw confidently comforted Lisa. He took out a tough, soft rope from his space ring and wrapped it tightly around Lisa's back, preventing her from falling off midway. After doing all this, Han Shaw grasped the Demon Slayer edge in his right hand and looked coldly at the 2 Griffin knights circling in the sky, preparing to slaughter the 2 humans and 2 magical beasts. "Let's see where you're going." One of the Griffin knight above sneered disdainfully. He waved the sharp javelin in his hand and kicked the waist of the griffin he was riding in an odd manner. The griffin circling in the sky suddenly screeched strangely and dove straight for Han Shaw. The griffin's iron claws could tear a wild ox apart. When it swiped at Han Shaw, its enormous body and the knight's cold javelin created a ferocious aura that shocked the soul. The other Griffin knight drove the griffin closer to Han Shaw, but didn't immediately make a move. His face was filled with arrogance and disdain, as if he felt that any one of them was more than enough to deal with Han Shaw. He didn't need to make a move at all. Han Shaw's expression was cold as he stood where he was, not moving an inch. His eyes stared closely at the knight and the griffin descending. A white bone staff suddenly appeared in Han Shaw's other hand when the griffin's iron claws were about to reach the trees of the forest. A dark mist spell was quickly cast by Han Shaw. With the amplification effect of the white bone staff, The dark mist spell that Han Shoror had cast had its range increased by 3 times. The area within 10 meters was completely enveloped in darkness. Damn it, I can't see anything. The Griffin Knight shouted angrily, his voice a bit panicked. He'd been chasing after Han Shoror all this time and saw that Han Shoror had been running on foot from beginning to end. That kind of speed was obviously that of a strong swordsman. Han Shoror had been wielding the sword-shaped Demon Slayer edge ever since he'd arrived in the forest. His movements and postures were completely that of a swordsman's. However, when it came time for the real fight, a white bone staff suddenly appeared in Han Shoror's hand, and he'd cast the dark mist spell in the time it took for sparks to fly off a flint. This immediately gave the Griffin Knight a fright, and he'd instantly fallen into the trap that Han Shoror had long since planned. When the Griffin Knight cried out in alarm, the other Griffin Knight standing proudly in the distance already knew that something wasn't right. He swiftly moved to help his comrade. Unfortunately, it was already too late. In the thick darkness, a bewitching red flame was so dazzling. It didn't seem to be affected by the dark mist spell in the slightest as it thrillingly displayed its wondrous trajectory in the darkness, outlining a long, blood-red line. The Griffin's strange cries of pain and the Griffin Knight's shrill screams seemed to appear along with the bewitching red flame. As the blood-red line streaked through the darkness, terrifying cries of pain rang out incessantly. Only when the bewitching red flame was extinguished did the cries of pain and despair finally return to silence. The other Griffin Knight, who'd already arrived in the area, felt his scalp tingle as he listened to the tragic cries. He couldn't see what was happening with his eyes, and could only ask anxiously, "Kemp, what's going on? What happened?" He kept yelling, but the Griffin Knight didn't dare approach the dark mist, and could only drive the Griffin Knight to observe from afar. The dark mist spell came quickly, and disappeared just as quickly. The dark mist that had suddenly gathered quickly disappeared under a gust of chilly wind. Han Shoror stood motionless in the same position with a cruel, callous, and sinister smile on his face. On his back, Lisa buried her head deep into Han Shoror's neck, her eyes tightly shut. She couldn't bear to look at Han Shoror. Around Han Shoror, there were bloody severed limbs and flesh scattered all over the ground. Some belonged to the Griffin Knight, while others belonged to the Griffin Knight. The thick stench of blood was extremely pungent. Han Shoror raised his foot and stepped on a head with brain juice slowly flowing out. Han Shoror looked as if he'd been baptized in blood. His face and body were covered in blood, making his already sinister expression look even more terrifying. A retching sound suddenly came from the observing Griffin Knight. After that retching sound, he immediately spurred the Griffin to fly far away in fear. "Do you think you're the only one who can fly?" Han Shoror cackled cruelly as he activated the art of the demonic ninth heavens. His body broke through the air and shot towards the Griffin Knight with Lisa in tow. Before the Griffin Knight could fly too far, Han Shoror's body had already appeared behind him. 2 bone spears shot out and stabbed into the Griffin's rear rump, causing the Griffin Knight to let out a shrill screech. It actually turned around and charged towards Han Shoror with the Griffin Knight. The Griffin Knight had gone through the initial panic and was now being carried by the Griffin Knight towards Han Shoror. He quickly understood that Han Shoror, who could fly, wouldn't give him a chance to escape. Therefore, he raised the javelin in his hand and shot it towards Han Shoror. Every Griffin Knight was a former adept knight. Therefore, when the Griffin Knight raised his javelin, a deep green fighting aura blossomed out and was like a bolt of silver lightning in the air. He borrowed the momentum of the Griffin Knight's charge to directly stab towards Han Shoror. Han Shoror had just used the Demon Slayer edge's sharpness to cut a Griffin Knight and his Griffin into pieces. An irrepressible thirst for blood and slaughter welled up in his heart. It was as if a voice in his heart was urging Han Shoror to continue this bloody slaughter. When he saw the Griffin Knight charging over, that irrepressible thirst for blood and slaughter was the perfect opportunity to vent. Howling fiercely at the sky, Han Shoror cackled as he leapt forward. The Demon Slayer edge, which wasn't particularly long to begin with, actually spat out a 2-meter-long purple and red light due to the circulation of the mystical glacial spellfire. The purple light was in front and the red light was connected to the Demon Slayer edge from behind, appearing quite mystical. When the art of the demonic ninth heavens was deployed, Han Shuo's speed wasn't much slower than the Griffin Knight's, even with Lisa on his back. Circulating his magical yuan at full force, the thick killing aura emanating from Han Shuo's body formed a cloud of black mist around his body. From afar, the image of Han Shuo holding the Demon Slayer edge looked like a meteor crashing to the earth. A dazzling ball of light exploded from the point of contact between the two as the deafening sound of metal clashing rang out in the surroundings. The Demon Slayer edge, which was imbued with the mystical glacial spellfire, shot out a meter-long cold purple light. When it met with the fighting aura on the spear, the Griffin Knight's tightly gripped spear was crushed to pieces by the violent magical yuan. The bone-chilling cold spread through the Griffin Knight's entire body in an instant. He only shivered and hadn't had the time to defend against the cold poison that had entered his body when another meter of red spellfire condensed. Under the burning of the bone-chilling cold and the fire poison, the veins in the Griffin Knight's right arm that had just gripped the silver spear suddenly ruptured. His muscles tightened and loosened, dripping blood as if acid had been poured on them. "You shouldn't have chased me." Han Shuo grinned viciously as he faced the terrified Griffin Knight. After saying these words, the Demon Slayer edge suddenly spun according to his will and chopped off the Griffin Knight's iron claws. He then raised the Demon Slayer edge and chopped downwards, chopping the Griffin Knight and the Griffin into two halves with the force of a mountain. Fresh blood sprayed out like rain, sprinkling into the forest. The two Griffin Knights had been brutally killed by Han Shuo, but Han Shuo still felt that he hadn't had enough. At this moment, Han Shuo was startled and abruptly reacted. He finally understood why he had such a strong desire to kill. After his magical yuan had reached the true demon realm, Han Shuo had truly become a demon. This was the first time that Han Shuo possessed such tyrannical strength in this realm, and it was very difficult for him to suppress the desires in the depths of his heart. This was especially true for the next realm after the true demon realm, which was the most dangerous bloodlust realm. Before entering the bloodlust realm, demonic practitioners would begin to have the desire to kill in every battle. It was a good thing that he hadn't entered the bloodlust realm yet, so Han Shuo could still control his thoughts and desires. Once Han Shuo reached the bloodlust realm, it would be even more difficult for him to control his desire to kill. Once a battle began, he wouldn't rest until there was blood and would become an extremely bloodthirsty demon. Exhaling lightly, Han Shuo thought to himself that the training of magical yuan was truly very dangerous and perverse. However, the carefree slaughter today had made Han Shuo feel quite satisfied. His entire being felt as if he'd been reborn. "Over there, chase them." The whinnying of a large group of horses sounded from afar. Han Shuo stopped high in the air and looked into the distance. He discovered that a squad of Griffin Legion cavalry was quickly charging in his direction. This squad was made up of well-trained knights, so Han Shuo wasn't afraid that he wouldn't be able to shake them off. Snorting coldly, Han Shuo's body flew through the air and dived downwards. He only abruptly sped off when he was level with the trees. "You can actually fly." It was only at this moment that Lisa suddenly moved her lips to Han Shuo's ear and exclaimed in indescribable shock. Chapter 161. Han Shuo put Lisa down in the middle of a rocky slope in the desolate outskirts of Valin City. With the art of the demonic ninth heavens, the 10-meter-tall city walls couldn't stop Han Shuo from crossing them at all. The current Valin City was in a state of chaos. The Griffin Legion seemed to have taken stimulants as they went about capturing suspects. As a direct participant, Han Shuo was being chased by a troop of cavalry. It was only natural that he would temporarily leave the city to hide for Lisa's sake. Suddenly, Lisa, who had been put down by Han Shuo, fiercely hugged Han Shuo from behind. Her abnormally well-developed breasts pressed tightly against Han Shuo's back. Han Shuo could clearly feel the soft, smooth, and firm sensation. Han Shuo had been carrying Lisa on his back the entire time, but because of the dangerous situation, Han Shuo had been fighting and dodging all the time and hadn't paid attention to anything else. Now that the two of them were out of danger, Lisa suddenly hugged Han Shuo from behind. This immediately gave Han Shuo a strange feeling. "Do you like it?" Lisa pressed her chest against Han Shuo's from behind. She moved her cherry lips to Han Shuo's ear and blew out a breath of hot air, speaking shyly in a low voice. Taking a deep breath, Hanshaw flipped over to face Lisa. He used a bit of force to release Lisa from his body and smiled. All right, we're safe for now. It'll be harder for the Griffin Legion to capture us now that we've left Valin City. Don't worry. Pouting, Lisa once again moved closer to Hanshaw and suddenly hugged Hanshaw. Her two arms locked tightly around Hanshaw's waist and she said softly, I'm nothing now. All my family is gone. What should I do in the future? Patting Lisa's shoulder, Hanshaw reassured her, Don't worry, Lawrence will definitely take care of you. He immediately rushed over from the Empire's capital after learning of your accident. He really loves you very much. When I was young, I played with Cousin Lawrence, and he loved me very much at that time. Hehe, for so many years, he has treated me like a real brother. I am very grateful to him. Lisa said innocently when she heard Hanshaw mention Lawrence. She then cried out in alarm and said with great worry, Oh no, Brother Lawrence didn't leave with us. Will he be in danger? Don't worry, your brother Lawrence isn't a simple person. If he can't even get through this little danger, then he would have lived all these years in vain. As the third prince, Lawrence had always been taught by his ambitious mother. In addition, he was highly regarded by His Majesty the Empire and had a few experts by his side to assist him. It shouldn't be a problem for him to leave safely. Oh right, you still haven't answered me. Why can you fly? Hanshaw's words of comfort were quite useful to Lisa. She suddenly thought of this matter after letting out a sigh of relief. Her beautiful eyes stared closely at Hanshaw. This is a bit hard to explain. I can only tell you that I'm not using the levitation technique that only archmages can use. As for how I'm able to fly, I can only say that it's a peculiar martial technique. Whether it was to Emily or Lisa, this art of the demonic ninth heavens wasn't easy to explain, nor could it be explained clearly. Therefore, Hanshaw could only muddle through. A group of more than 10 people suddenly appeared in the distance and slowly walked in the direction of Valin City. Hanshaw took a look from afar and didn't think much of it when he discovered that these people weren't wearing the clothes of the Griffin Legion. He continued to stand there and talk to Lisa. The rocky slope that Hanshaw and Lisa were on happened to be where they'd passed by. When the group neared Hanshaw, a soft exclamation suddenly sounded from within. Brian, what are you doing here? Hanshaw started and then looked at the group of people. He suddenly discovered that there was a familiar face, Candace, amongst them. The well-built Candace carried a broadsword on her back and wore a thin, tight swordsman's uniform. She looked as if she didn't fear the onslaught of winter. When she saw that Hanshaw was here, she turned around and gestured to the mercenaries behind her, walking valiantly towards Hanshaw. When she arrived in front of Hanshaw, she swept a glance at Hanshaw and said with a slight frown, You wouldn't have taken this little girl to such a rocky slope in such cold weather, would you? None of your business. Lisa flicked a glance at Candace, seeming to dislike the tone of her voice as she yelled unkindly. Struggling for a bit, Hanshaw extricated himself from Lisa's embrace. He first looked at the Battlefire mercenary band behind Candace and discovered that there were a total of 6 of them. 5 of them had spread out and were surrounding a beautiful girl with a veil over her face, seeming to be protecting her safety. Glancing behind Candace, Hanshaw understood that Candace had perhaps accepted a mission and was protecting the veiled girl. He then turned his gaze to Candace and said with a light smile, Long time no see, Candace. You must have accepted another mission and are currently in the middle of it. Nodding her head, Candace calmly admitted it. She laughed heartily and replied, That's right, my life is one of hard work. How could I be as carefree as you? You still have the leisure to come here and have a secret rendezvous on such a cold day. Don't make wild guesses, we just happened to land here because of a few things. Hanshaw smiled wryly at Candace and opened his mouth to explain. It's just a tryst, what does that have to do with you? Lisa's little mouth pouted and seemed to have recovered her shrewdness from back in the academy. She glared at Candace like a belligerent little hen provoking her. All right, what's there to argue about? Hanshaw was a bit baffled and patted Lisa with a smile, indicating for her to speak less. This little girl is a bit interesting, hey. Oh right, Brian, how are things between you and Phoebe? Candace looked at Lisa with amusement and then stared at Hanshaw. Same old, I'm doing business with her. She's taken over the merchant guild and has been incredibly busy lately. Han Shoror responded carelessly and suddenly asked Candace, "Are you going to Valin City this time?" Nodding, Candace said, "That's right. We've accepted a mission this time to protect Miss Belinda on her way to Valin City. We'll send her back safely after she's finished with her business in Valin City." Because Candace and Han Shoror had experienced life and death together last time, Candace had already acknowledged Han Shoror in the depths of her heart. Therefore, she didn't have any reservations and calmly stated the objective of this time's mission. A thought occurred to Han Shoror and he thought for a moment before reminding Candace, Valin City hasn't been very peaceful recently. Of the 2 sons of Griffin Legion Commander Bob Asher, one has been missing for a few months and the other, Clark, was killed just 2 days ago. The chief is extremely angry and everyone in Valin City is on high alert. If there's nothing particularly important, I suggest that your employer doesn't choose this time to enter the city. Thank you, I'll mention your suggestion to my employer, but it's not up to me to decide if she's willing to listen. Candace was quite surprised when she heard of this matter. It was obvious from her furrowed brow that this matter was very important to her, but she was a mercenary. Once she'd accepted her employer's request, she had to follow through with the original agreement. She had no right to change anything even if something went wrong along the way, or she'd have to bear additional compensation. Therefore, she could only say this. Nodding, Han Shoror was about to say something when his brow suddenly furrowed and he abruptly turned to look in the direction that Candace and the others had come from. He hesitated for a moment before asking, "Did you encounter any danger along the way?" Candace started and then suddenly thought of Han Shoror's miraculous abilities. Her charming face froze and she quickly responded, "We did encounter some danger along the way, but it was quite easy for us to deal with." "Why do you say this? Did you discover something?" "There was another group of people behind you when you appeared. Apart from me, they had nothing to do with you at first and should be another group heading into Valin City. However, when a gust of wind blew over just now, I seemed to hear the words Belinda through the wind. If I'm not wrong, this group of people who've been keeping a distance from you must have something to do with your employer, Belinda." Han Shoror responded with a frown. If it had been anyone else who'd said Han Shoror's words, Candace wouldn't have believed them at all because even she hadn't been able to see any movement from such a distance. Not only had Han Shoror sensed that a group of people was following them, but he'd also heard their voices through the wind. This was an unimaginable matter. Only a wind Grand Magus would be able to borrow the wind's power and hear the voices of people far away. Han Shoror was obviously far from this level. However, Candace, who'd gone through trials and tribulations with Han Shoror, understood that Han Shoror possessed miraculous abilities. Having long since witnessed Han Shoror's abilities, Candace believed Han Shoror's words without any doubt. Her long eyelashes fluttered as she furrowed her brow in thought and said to Han Shoror, "Which direction are they in, how many people are there, and roughly how strong are they?" Chapter 162. There are 3 people 500 meters behind you. Because of the distance and their ordinary attire, I can't tell how strong they are. Han Shoror took note of the situation and observed for a while with narrowed eyes before answering Candace's question in a low voice. "Thank you, Brian. I'll remember your help." Candace exclaimed softly and didn't say anything more to Han Shoror. She turned around and returned to the Battlefire mercenary band, discussing a few things with the other mercenaries. "Who is she to you? Why are you willing to help her?" Lisa tugged on Han Shoror's sleeve after Candace left and asked Han Shoror. "An old friend. Let's go, we'll leave this place from the other side. We still have to return to Valin City in a bit." Han Shoror looked at Candace and saw that she was still in discussion with her employer and a few people from the Battlefire mercenary band. He knew that his words had already made Candace understand. Candace was a mercenary and had her own missions and lifestyle. Han Shoror had come across her and seen that there were hidden dangers in her mission, so he gave her a careless reminder out of goodwill. He could be considered to have done his part as a friend, but he wouldn't interfere in her matters. Lisa didn't say anything when she heard that Han Shoror wanted to leave. She lowered her head a bit bashfully and walked to Han Shoror's back, wrapping her arms around his neck. She leapt onto Han Shoror's back and smiled merrily in Han Shoror's ear. "I still want you to carry me." Han Shoror was speechless and laughed helplessly. He said to Lisa on his back, "I had no choice but to carry you on my back because the situation was urgent just now. Now that we're out of danger, you don't need me to carry you anymore. It's fine if we walk slowly back to the city." "Hihi, I don't care what you say, I'm not getting off." Lisa's small hands wrapped around Han Shoror's neck and her two meaty thighs crossed over Han Shoror's waist, appearing very pleased. Lisa was at the age of youth and vitality. Because of Han Shoror's encouragement and guidance, Lisa's originally flat chest had become ridiculously full. Han Shoror even felt that her chest wasn't much smaller than Emily's from the shape of her back. The soft beauty of her chest pressed so tightly against his body made Han Shoror feel a bit restless. In the distance, Candace conversed with her employer and companions for a bit. She seemed to have made up her mind to continue on to Valen City and didn't pay any attention to the three people tailing them. After making up their minds, they continued towards Valen City. Candace looked over from afar and happened to see Han Shoror carrying Lisa on his back. She couldn't help but reveal an astonished expression. Lisa, who was on Han Shoror's back, raised her head proudly when she saw Candace's astonished gaze, as if showing off something to Candace. Candace couldn't help but let out a soft laugh. "Hold on tight, we're going as well." Seeing that Lisa was determined to carry him, Han Shoror didn't force her to come down. Lisa had just lost her parents and was at her most dejected and pained time. Han Shoror didn't want to upset her at this time, so he instructed in a low voice and walked off from another path, avoiding Candace's group and heading towards Valen City in a different direction. It was already evening. Han Shoror determined the direction and circled around the city walls. When night fell, he used the art of the demonic ninth heavens to bring Lisa over the city walls and into Valen City. Arriving at the hotel Emily had stayed in last time, Han Shoror walked straight to the room Emily was staying in. Before Han Shoror had even entered, he heard Chester call out in a low voice, "Who is it?" "It's me," Han Shoror replied and pushed open the door to walk in. He then looked at Chester in surprise and asked, "Why are you here?" Chester looked at Lisa on Han Shoror's back and hesitated before replying, "Madam Emily said that this might be the place where you and Lawrence would meet up, so she told me to stay here and perhaps wait for news from either you or Lawrence." "Then, have you received any news from Lawrence?" Emily had arranged for people from the Dark Mantle to watch over this place. On one hand, because of Lisa, Han Shoror couldn't go directly to the Dark Mantle. On the other hand, Han Shoror had told Lawrence that he was staying at this place. If Lawrence escaped, he would contact him here. Therefore, Han Shoror had decided to stay here temporarily. Nodding, Chester replied, "Lawrence didn't come, but he sent someone here. That person told me that if you and Lisa came back, you should send Lisa to this location." Chester handed a card to Han Shoror as he spoke. The location recorded on the card wasn't far from here. What did the person Chester sent look like? Han Shoror had to ask cautiously just in case. After Chester described the person's appearance, Han Shoror immediately knew that it was the old assassin Lucky. Therefore, he knew that there shouldn't be any problems with this matter. Putting Lisa down, Han Shoror looked at Lisa and said seriously, "Lisa, what we're doing is very dangerous. Follow Chester to where your cousin Lawrence is. Lawrence will send you back to the Empire in a short period of time. Be good, understand? We'll stay here and help you take revenge." After experiencing the tragic changes in her life, Lisa was much more mature than Han Shoror had imagined. After Han Shoror finished speaking, although Lisa's expression was a bit reluctant, she still nodded obediently and agreed to Han Shoror's arrangements. Hire a carriage and personally take Miss Lisa to the location on Lawrence's card. Hand her safely into Lawrence's hands. Han Shoror smiled as he looked at Chester. "Don't worry, there won't be any problems with me doing this." Chester promised Han Shoror very confidently and then bowed to Lisa, making an inviting gesture. Lisa looked deeply at Han Shoror and said a bit worriedly to Han Shoror after a while, "Be careful, don't let anything happen to you." "Don't worry, I'll be fine. Hurry and leave with him while it's still dark." Han Shoror nodded and urged Lisa with a smile. After Han Shoror's words, Lisa turned and followed Chester, the two quickly making their way outside. The Dark Mantle's influence in such a large city naturally wasn't small. If Han Shoror was willing to send Lisa back to the Empire, it wouldn't be too much of a hassle. However, Han Shoror had just joined the Dark Mantle and it wasn't too good for him to use the Dark Mantle's resources for personal matters. In addition, Lawrence was the third prince. If he was in charge of this matter, he would make proper arrangements for Lisa's arrival in the Empire. After Lisa left, Han Shoror turned and walked into the inner room, saying with a smile, "Come out." Emily, neatly dressed in a soft fur coat, walked out from the inner room with a smile. She rolled her eyes at Han Shoror when she arrived next to him and reached out to pinch Han Shoror. She said with a bit of jealousy, "You went to Lawrence's place and abducted his sister back. You even made him come to me to ask for her. You're really something." Grasping Emily's pinching hand and pulling, Han Shoror pulled Emily into his embrace, his hands roaming all over Emily's voluptuous body. He smiled and explained, "I'm not as bad as you imagine me to be. It's only because Lawrence's location was exposed that I had no choice but to take her and escape." After explaining the course of events, Emily was relieved. She then said to Han Shoror with a frown, "According to Lawrence, he may have come to deal with Bobby Asher with the king's tacit approval. This may be one of the king's methods to test Lawrence. Lawrence's future path will be determined through his performance this time." Han Shoror was slightly startled when he heard Emily's words. Han Shoror hadn't thought so much and only reacted after hearing Emily's words. After musing for a moment, Han Shoror opened his mouth. "If this is the case, then there is still a possibility of us cooperating with Lawrence. Indeed, Dark Mantle members aren't bound by any restrictions when carrying out missions. If the timing is right, I don't mind cooperating with Lawrence. However, we need to be sure of exactly how to act." Emily's slender eyebrows were tightly knit as she spoke thoughtfully. Emily's concerns stemmed from Lawrence's identity as prince. She was afraid that others would misunderstand their relationship with Lawrence before the situation was clear. If Lawrence couldn't become king in the end and another prince took over, then Emily, Han Shoror, and the others who were too close to Lawrence would very likely face unexpected misfortune. Therefore, Emily was very cautious. "I understand what you mean. Don't worry, I know my limits in my dealings with Lawrence," Han Shoror said in a low voice. After thinking for a moment, Han Shoror suddenly asked Emily, "Right, you left in a hurry to report to your brother about the Calamity Church. You also warned me repeatedly not to mention this church to anyone else. Why was that?" Emily's charming face became incomparably solemn when she heard these words. She took a deep breath before replying to Han Shoror, "The Calamity Church is an evil church. They worship all sorts of evil gods and have gathered many evil experts with terrifying strength. I've only heard a bit about this church and don't know the specifics. However, I understand from my brother that this Calamity Church can be said to be the largest evil cult on the entire continent. They do some shady deeds behind the scenes that infuriate both men and gods. Every time they move, they are a huge threat to every country. A few empires allied together to eradicate the Calamity Church a few decades ago and completely wiped out all of the Calamity Church's exposed strongholds. There was no news of the Calamity Church for a very long time. However, the empires all knew that the Calamity Church's main force hadn't been wiped out and that they were only in hiding. This time, you've obtained the necromancer's memories and know that he's from the Calamity Church. This matter is of great importance to the higher-ups." Stunned, Han Shoror looked at Emily in astonishment and asked, "Could it be that you've also reported to the higher-ups that I obtained the necromancer's memories?" "Of course not." Emily rolled her eyes at Han Shoror, as if blaming Han Shoror for not believing her. After Han Shoror smiled apologetically, she said again, "I only said that we worked together to kill the necromancer and obtained some information regarding this from his space ring. So that's how it is. It looks like this necromancer is a big fish." Han Shoror thought for a bit and responded with a smile. As he spoke, Han Shoror took out the white bone staff and played with it in his hand as he spoke. A strange buzzing sound suddenly came from the white bone staff, like the low cry of an unknown insect. This caused Han Shoror to be horrified and appear to be quite astonished. "Is no one doing business in this inn?" At this moment, Han Shoror heard a familiar voice come from outside the inn. It was Candace's loud yelling. The white bone staff continued to make strange sounds and tremble, as if it wanted to break free from Hanshaw's grasp and fly away. This caused both Hanshaw and Emily to be quite shocked. "Hey, Miss Belinda, where are you going? You can't leave alone." Candace's yelling suddenly turned into anxious shouts, as if her employer, Belinda, had suddenly walked out of the Battlefire mercenary band's protective circle. "Brian, what's going on? Why has the white bone staff suddenly stopped moving?" Emily looked at the trembling white bone staff in Hanshaw's hand and asked anxiously. Grasping the trembling white bone staff with all his strength, Hanshaw was also a bit baffled. He shook his head and quickly replied, "I don't know what's going on either. This has never happened when I used this staff in the past." As soon as he finished speaking, the sound of disorderly footsteps quickly approached, followed by Candace's cry of alarm. Hanshaw's heart jumped as if he'd faintly grasped something. He immediately put the white bone staff back into his space ring and gestured to Emily, quietly walking towards the window. Chapter 163. He pushed the window up a bit and opened a narrow crack. Through this crack, Hanshaw could see the scene outside. Candace's employer, Belinda, was wearing a veil, revealing only a pair of sapphire eyes. There was a strange expression in them as she seemed to be searching for something. She walked to the hallway of Hanshaw and Emily's room and looked around. Candace and a few others from the Battlefire mercenary band ran over frantically from behind Belinda. Candace had a face full of wariness as she pressed a hand to the magic sword on her back and looked around carefully, afraid that something might happen to Belinda. Candace finally breathed a sigh of relief after the other mercenaries surrounded Belinda. She chided Belinda, who was still looking around. "Miss Belinda, I hope that you'll let us know in advance when you're moving around in the future. We were only hired by you to protect you and not restrict your freedom. There's no need for you to run away so suddenly." Belinda's long and slender eyebrows were furrowed tightly behind her veil as she looked around with her beautiful eyes, appearing quite puzzled. Belinda seemed to suddenly come to her senses after Candace's displeased words and said apologetically to Candace, "I'm sorry, I just thought I saw someone I knew and hurried over to take a look. It was just my eyes playing tricks on me." Candace was also quite puzzled by her words and said to Belinda in surprise, "There was no one here just now. How did you see someone? This is too strange." "Oh, perhaps it's because I haven't had enough sleep lately and my eyes are playing tricks on me. I'm very sorry." Belinda's bright eyes swept over Hanshaw and Emily's room as she responded carelessly to Candace. Panicked footsteps could be heard from behind. A plump middle-aged woman walked over with a smile, holding a book in her hand. He first bowed politely, then said apologetically, "Esteemed guests, you must be here to stay. I had to leave for a while just now, I'm very sorry. Please follow me to the counter to register. There's no one watching over this hotel, that's worrying. In addition, the environment here doesn't seem to be too good. Would Miss Belinda like to switch to another hotel?" Candace didn't seem to like this place and suggested to her employer, Belinda, with a sour face. The veiled Belinda looked around with her bright eyes and said, "No need, I'll stay here. I think it's not bad here." "All right then." Candace had no choice but to listen to her employer and responded with a bit of disappointment. "Excuse me, who are the people staying in the rooms on the side of this corridor?" Belinda turned around and seemed to be asking the fat hotel owner casually. "I'm sorry, it's not convenient for us to disclose that. That's our customers' privacy. I'm sorry." The owner of this hotel was quite principled. Judging from her expression, she very much wanted Candace and the others to stay, but she didn't budge when it came to her principles. Nodding, Belinda didn't pursue the matter and said gently, "That's fine as well. Are there any empty rooms around this corridor? I'll stay here if there are." The woman's eyes lit up and she quickly flipped through the book in her hand, then pointed at a room not far from Hanshaw and Emily. "There's an empty room here, but the conditions aren't the best in the hotel. If the esteemed miss doesn't mind, you can stay in this room immediately." "No problem, I'll take this room." "Candace, do as you see fit," Belinda said gently, and her bright eyes flicked faintly at Hanshaw and Emily's rooms, then took the lead to walk to the room she'd reserved. The owner of this hotel had long since known that Belinda was the owner of this group. When she saw Belinda walk in that direction, she quickly fished out a bunch of keys and opened the door for her when she reached it, letting her in. "You guys go in and protect the miss first. I'll take care of the paperwork and arrange other rooms around Miss Belinda's." Candace gave some instructions to the other members of the Battlefire mercenary band when she saw Belinda enter, and then followed the happy fat woman back to the front desk to take care of the check-in procedures. When the other members of the Battlefire mercenary band had followed Belinda into the room, Hanshaw closed the crack in the window and said lowly to Emily beside him, "The strange movements of the white bone staff must have something to do with this Belinda. Her identity is very suspicious." Emily had also seen a bit of what had happened just now and immediately nodded in agreement when she heard Hanshaw's words. She said very gravely, "It looks like this Belinda is related to the necromancer you killed. Since you've obtained all of his memories, don't you have any impression of this Belinda?" Hanshaw furrowed his brow and shook his head with certainty. "No, this Belinda has never appeared in Clarendon's memories. I really don't understand why she can sense the white bone staff. How did Clarendon obtain this white bone staff?" Emily started and changed her question to Hanshaw after thinking for a bit. Clarendon was rewarded by the upper echelons of the Calamity Church after he completed a certain number of missions. He only knew how to use the white bone staff, but didn't know its origins. Hanshaw closed his eyes and thought for a bit before speaking to Emily. "It looks like this Belinda should be from the Calamity Church. Perhaps it's because of Clarendon's disappearance that she's appeared here. We need to be careful." Emily thought for a bit and said gravely, "Belinda was Candace's employer. If she was from the Calamity Church, then why would she ask Candace to protect her when she came to Vallin City?" This was something that Hanshaw couldn't quite understand. However, since Belinda could sense the white bone staff, this meant that her origins weren't simple. When he connected this to what Emily had said about the evils of the Calamity Church, Hanshaw began to ponder inwardly. This Belinda must be suspicious of the rooms in this hallway. "I think we should temporarily leave this place and switch rooms to observe this Belinda." Hanshaw looked at Emily and suggested after thinking for a bit. Nodding, Emily said confidently, "No problem, the owner of this hotel is one of us. We can switch rooms if we want." No wonder Emily would choose to stay in this hotel when she arrived in Vallin City. So it was because the owner of this hotel was also a member of the Dark Mantle. It looked like the Dark Mantle's intelligence network was quite extensive indeed. Taking advantage of Candace's absence, Belinda and the other members of the Battlefire mercenary band entered the room. Hanshaw and Emily left the room and snuck out from the other side, arriving in a large hall on the second floor. Hanshaw and Emily leaned against the window and could see the front yard. Emily activated some mechanism and the owner of the hotel, the middle-aged woman, appeared merrily in the hall after a while. She still wore a professional smile and bowed slightly to Emily, asking with a smile, "What are your orders, Madam Emily?" "Sister Elaine, arrange a new room for us. It's best if it's a bit away from Belinda, but still within view of her room." Emily also smiled amiably as she spoke. The middle-aged woman named Elaine was a bit surprised when she heard Emily's words. She thought for a bit and said, "3 people just came in and also requested a room where they can see Miss Belinda." His thoughts raced. Hanshaw thought of the 3 people who'd been tailing Candace. He couldn't help but ask, "Where are they staying now? Have you arranged a room for them?" "Don't worry, I've purposely left a room where they can observe Belinda. I saw that Belinda's gaze when she looked at your room just now and knew that there was something wrong with her." Elaine flicked a glance at Hanshaw and revealed a look that said, "Don't worry about me taking care of things. Sister Elaine has made many contributions to our organization over the years. Although she doesn't know martial arts or magic, she's very observant. That's why I'm staying here in Vallin City." Emily also rolled her eyes at Hanshaw and explained with a smile, "All right, Madam Emily, don't praise me so much. I'll arrange a new room for you. Also, I'll keep an eye on the people who just arrived today. If there's anything, I'll report to you immediately." Elaine turned around and walked out of the room. "All right, let's make our preparations as well. We need to keep a close eye on that woman." Perhaps uncovering her identity will bring us great benefits, Emily said. Chapter 164. They moved to another room. This room was separated by the fake mountain in the courtyard, and they could see the window of Belinda's room on the other side. Candace seemed to be discussing something with Belinda after she'd returned, and hadn't come out since. The other mercenaries of the Battlefire mercenary band had been arranged by Candace into the 2 rooms next to Belinda's. The 3 people who'd been following Candace entered the hotel and stayed next to Han Shoror's group. Using a magical mirror, Han Shoror and Emily could see the movements of the 3 people in front of them. The 3 people in the group were 3 men with ordinary looks, and their appearances were actually quite similar. It looked like they might be brothers. When they moved into the next room, one of them leaned against the window and observed Belinda, while the other 2 seemed to be too tired and directly fell asleep on the bed. It was still daytime, and neither group made any movements, maintaining a steady silence. Han Shoror observed for a bit and saw that there were no abnormalities on either side. He returned to Emily's side and thought for a bit, "You stay here and keep watch for me. I'm going back to the Cemetery of Death to see what's going on inside before coming back." "Oh, why are you suddenly thinking of going back to the Cemetery of Death?" Emily was a bit surprised by Han Shoror's decision and looked at Han Shoror in confusion. Smiling mysteriously, Han Shoror said, "I've recently taken in a lackey. I'm going to see if his injuries have healed." As they spoke, Han Shoror walked into the inner room and lifted the wooden boards of the cupboard, setting up a transportation matrix inside. Emily had long since grown accustomed to Han Shoror's mysteriousness. She didn't ask further when she saw that Han Shoror was about to leave and said, "All right then, I'll stay here and observe them. I'll go pull you back if anything happens. It's best if you don't stray too far from the Cemetery of Death. Don't worry, I'll be in the Cemetery of Death. You can come find me at any time if there's anything out of the ordinary." Han Shoror answered, then stood in the teleportation array, closed the wooden door of the cupboard, and activated the teleportation array. "Gilbert, where the hell did you go?" Han Shoror immediately yelled as soon as he returned to the Cemetery of Death. With a whoosh, the little lewd dragon Gilbert appeared in front of Han Shoror and kowtowed as soon as he arrived. He said pitifully, "Honorable Master, you've finally remembered your loyal servant. There's nothing fun to do in this damned place, and I can't go out either. I'm about to suffocate to death. I told you to look after that place for me. You didn't slack off, did you?" Before leaving, Han Shoror had instructed Gilbert to pay attention to the area where the Earth Elite zombie was being refined, in order to prevent any trouble from occurring. "Of course I'm not slacking off, but there's really nothing to see in that place. Nothing has changed since you left." "Oh, Honorable Master, when are you going to take me out to look for beautiful women?" Gilbert complained as he looked at Han Shoror. Compared to his charred appearance last time, the current Gilbert was dressed in a shiny black robe and his hair was meticulously combed. Apart from his skin being as dark as charcoal, the young Gilbert could be considered quite handsome. "How are your injuries?" Whether or not to take Gilbert out still depended on his physical condition. Although this little lewd dragon was a mess, his strength as a dark dragon was extraordinary and he would be a good helper. Gilbert puffed out his chest when he heard this question and boasted, "There's no problem. As one of the dark dragons with the strongest physical bodies on the continent, this kind of injury isn't a problem for me." "Cut the crap, how are your injuries?" Han Shoror glared and shouted softly. As his master, Han Shoror was bound by a contract with him and could more or less sense the state of his body. Although his body was much better than before, Han Shoror could feel that he hadn't fully recovered yet. Therefore, he couldn't help but shout when he heard Gilbert's boastfulness. Shrinking his head, Gilbert smiled apologetically, "I haven't fully recovered yet, but it's no big deal. I definitely won't drag you down." Nodding, Han Shoror said, "All right, I'll consider taking you out, probably in the next 2 days. Rest assured and heal your injuries. If you drag me down when I need your help in the future, I won't let you off the hook." Han Shoror got up and walked towards the area where the Earth Elite zombie had been refined. In the center of the area where the Earth Elite zombie had been hidden, a large part of the area had sunk in. The thick essence of Earth continued to slowly flow in. After observing his surroundings, Han Shaw concentrated his mental strength and connected with the zombie inside. When Han Shaw did this, he immediately felt a surging vitality. This vitality was brimming with rich earth energy, and Han Shaw immediately understood that the Earth Elite zombies' refinement was on the right track. This was because when ordinary zombies were summoned, they would only feel a deathly stillness when they connected with their mental strength. Only extremely powerful dark creatures, such as those evil knights, would be able to sense some vitality. Right now, this zombie warrior's body was filled with dense vitality and rich earth yuan qi. This meant that after absorbing the earth essence of this place of extreme earth, it was truly growing. Alright, you stay here and recuperate. I'll let you out in a few days. Seeing that the cemetery of death was safe, and that Dark Dragon Gilbert and the Earth Elite zombie were slowly recovering, Han Shaw also set his mind at rest and got up to return to the cemetery of death. After receiving Han Shaw's promise, Gilbert appeared to be very excited. He couldn't help but praise Han Shaw's wisdom and martial prowess beside Han Shaw. His fawning smile made Han Shaw not know whether to laugh or cry. When he walked into the cemetery of death, Han Shaw was about to use the transportation matrix to leave when he suddenly remembered that he hadn't entered the underground secret room in a while. Now that Han Shaw's mental strength had increased again, Han Shaw planned to try and see if he could advance to the next level. Leaving Gilbert where he was, Han Shaw walked down the secret room by himself. The boundary on the first level was easily broken by Han Shaw's mental strength, allowing Han Shaw to walk in. When he arrived at the same place on the next level, Han Shaw gathered his mental strength and suddenly dashed forward, wanting to descend to the next level of the cemetery of death. With a bang, Han Shaw crashed into the boundary and was instantly bounced off, a piercing pain in his head. Han Shaw, who had fallen to the ground, slowly stood up. He immediately understood that his mental strength wasn't enough to advance to the next level. With a thought, Han Shaw, still holding the Eye of Darkness in one hand, took out the white bone staff from his space ring. This cemetery of death had once been a holy land for necromancers, and the green Eye of Darkness was the key to opening the cemetery of death. The white bone staff had the effect of amplifying necromancy magic. Although its use was different from the Eye of Darkness, they were both necromancy magic items. Han Shaw held the two items in his hands and compared them, trying to see if there was anything in common. Looking at the two items in his hands, Han Shaw couldn't help but gather his mental strength. The Eye of Darkness suddenly flashed, and a green light suddenly shone brightly. A wave of power invaded the white bone staff, and a strand of black light suddenly shot out from the white bone staff, instantly entering the Eye of Darkness. Startled, Han Shaw ignored the Eye of Darkness and completely focused his mental strength, invading the white bone staff. Han Shaw hadn't felt anything out of the ordinary when his mental strength entered the white bone staff, but he suddenly discovered that there was a small, mysterious magical matrix within the staff. It's a magical brand boundary. No wonder Belinda could sense the white bone staff. Han Shaw's mental strength circled the white bone staff and immediately understood. In Clarendon's memories, there was a magical brand boundary that could exist on weapons and clothes, usually in the form of a magical matrix. Within a certain distance, the owner of the magical brand would be able to sense the existence of the magical brand through their own methods. It turned out that there was such a magical brand boundary within the white bone staff. Not only had the presence of magical elements obstructed Han Shaw's mental strength from the beginning, but it was also because of the residual magical elements that Belinda had sensed the existence of the white bone staff. Perhaps it was the effects of the Eye of Darkness that had absorbed the magical elements within the white bone staff. Without the support of the magical elements, the transportation matrix within the white bone staff could no longer be maintained. This was why Han Shaw was able to spy on the situation within. Han Shaw's mental strength entered the staff and spied a circle around the magical matrix. He discovered a line of small words, Alchemist Belinda of the Calamity Church, Opus 17. It's from the Calamity Church all right. Han Shaw exclaimed lowly and didn't continue to stay in the cemetery of death. He got up and returned to the hotel through the transportation matrix, planning on how to deal with Belinda. Chapter 165. From the transportation matrix to the cupboard, Han Shaw already felt that something was amiss before he even opened the cupboard's door. First, a faint fragrance entered Han Shaw's nose and mouth. A strong wave of dizziness suddenly assaulted him, and Han Shaw almost fainted in that instant. It was a good thing that Han Shaw's body was far more resilient than the average person after having been tempered by demonic magic, and the magical yuan had even more miraculous effects. When Han Shaw inhaled that faint fragrance into his abdomen, Han Shaw's body automatically circulated the magical yuan as soon as he felt the dizziness. The scent that had entered his abdomen was expelled from his body in the blink of an eye under the effect of the magical yuan. The dizziness that had occurred in that instant also disappeared. At this moment, Han Shaw held his breath and circulated the magical yuan in his body, then inhaled another breath of that fragrance. As soon as the scent entered his mouth, Han Shaw's tenacious nerves had long since prepared themselves for it. The feeling of dizziness appeared for a moment, but under the effects of the magical yuan and Han Shaw's strong willpower, the feeling of drowsiness turned from intense to mild, until it seemed to have no effect at all. Having reached the true demon realm in demonic magic, Han Shaw's body had been tempered beyond imagination. Even such a strong fragrance couldn't affect Han Shaw's movements. Not good. I wonder how Emily is. After his perverted body had adapted to the effects of the fragrance, Han Shaw suddenly thought of Emily in the room and hastily pushed open the cupboard in shock. Emily, who should have been in the room, had disappeared without a trace. He didn't know where she had gone. There were traces of rummaging in the room, and from the degree of disorder, it seemed that someone had been here. The transportation matrix that Han Shaw had set up was inside the cupboard, and the top of the magical wand had been covered by Han Shaw's clothes beforehand. Therefore, even if someone came to open the cupboard, they wouldn't be able to discover anything unless they looked carefully. As soon as he saw that the room had been turned over, and that Emily had disappeared, Han Shaw immediately became nervous. Just as Han Shaw was about to walk out of the room and look for Elaine, he suddenly realized that something was wrong with the entire hotel. Opening a corner of the window, Han Shaw found that it was already night time. However, looking into the distance, he could see that the houses in the distance were brightly lit, which meant that it was not yet late at night. But in this hotel, all the rooms were shrouded in darkness. Only Belinda's room seemed to have a faint light, and the faint sounds of conversation could be heard. While Han Shaw was holding his breath and concentrating, he discovered that there was a flying insect the size of a fly in the hotel's courtyard. There were a few dozen of these flying insects, and they scattered and flew around the various rooms of the hotel. Their tails exuded a grayish-brown gas. That was the same scent that had almost made Han Shaw fall asleep. Frowning, Han Shaw was almost certain that the strange changes in the hotel had something to do with Belinda. Silently opening the door, Han Shaw took out the black robes that members of the Dark Mantle wore during their operations and wrapped them around his body. He scuttled up to the roof in the darkness and slowly made his way to Belinda's room. As he did this, Han Shaw used magical yuan to conceal all of his presence with great familiarity. His heartbeat and breathing also adjusted to a very hard-to-detect frequency. Madam Belinda, all of the guests in this hotel have been gathered in the living room of this room. As soon as he arrived in Belinda's room and pressed his ear to it, Han Shaw heard a low voice coming from below. Belinda responded softly from inside and seemed to be walking towards the living room. Han Shaw carefully and lightly moved his body. When he arrived at the main hall, he lightly extended a finger and circulated the mystical glacial spellfire. A small flame rose from his finger and pierced through a wooden structure. He then peered down at the bottom of the hall. In a living room similar to Han Shaw's room, there were a dozen or so people who'd fainted from the drug. Among them were Emily, whom Han Shaw had been very worried about, Chester, who'd returned from sending Lisa to Lawrence, and the owner of the hotel, Elaine. Even Candace and the other members of the Battlefire mercenary band who'd been protecting Belinda were all unconscious. Apart from these people that Han Shaw was familiar with, there was also the great druid Caspian and the female elf Angelica. Han Shaw had met these two last time in the Dark Forest. He'd met the two separately then, but now that he saw them together, Han Shaw realized that the two were on the same side. The remaining guests didn't have any special characters and were likely here to do business in Valin City. They didn't attract Han Shaw's attention. The three people who'd been tailing Belinda were now standing there with respectful expressions, as if they were subordinates awaiting Belinda's orders. This surprised Han Shaw. He hadn't thought that these three people would be Belinda's people. Belinda's slender eyebrows were furrowed tightly when she arrived in the living room. She swept a glance at the people below and said softly, "I sensed activity from the number 17 bone staff when I arrived at the hotel. I'd personally refined that staff and awarded it to Clarendon as a reward. However, when I followed my senses to the hallway, the presence of the staff suddenly disappeared. It looks like someone must have suddenly stored it in a space ring. None of the guests have left the hotel since I've entered, so I can be sure that the staff is in one of their space rings. My lord, what should we do?" The eldest of the three brothers who were standing there respectfully asked Belinda. Belinda's sapphire eyes scanned the people on the ground and then pointed at Emily. The white bone staff should be on her. The only ones on the ground who had space rings were Emily, Candace, Caspian, and Angelica. Candace had been with them the entire time, so it was naturally impossible for her to have the staff. When Han Shaw hadn't entered the cemetery of death, the great druid and Angelica hadn't appeared in the hotel yet. In Belinda's eyes, Emily was the only one with the white bone staff. The one who had asked the question walked to Emily's side after Belinda's words and took off Emily's space ring, handing it to Belinda respectfully. Belinda took Emily's space ring and closed her eyes to feel it, saying, "She set up a magical boundary inside. Tie her up first and then wake her up." "My lord, what about the others?" It was still the eldest of the three brothers who asked. Waving her hand, Belinda said casually, "Same old rules. Those who have no value are to be dealt with immediately." Han Shaw immediately grew nervous when he heard these words. Apart from Emily, there were three familiar faces in the hall below: Candace, Angelica, and Caspian. Caspian had no connection to Han Shaw, but Candace and the little elf Angelica had some connection to Han Shaw. Han Shaw couldn't just watch the two girls be killed like this. "Don't you think your methods are a bit overboard?" Caspian, who should have been unconscious, suddenly spoke before Han Shaw could make a move. Caspian rose from his lying position as he spoke and shielded the little elf Angelica behind him. Han Shaw had been about to immediately make a move, but he immediately stopped when he saw this sudden change. He continued to lie on the roof and observe the activity below. "Hey! You're still able to remain conscious even under the effects of my powerful knockout powder. It looks like the great druids do have some miraculous powers." Belinda exclaimed softly in surprise and said calmly, "I don't care who you are, but your methods greatly disgust me. As long as you let everyone here go, I won't hold it against you for the harm you've done to us earlier and will let you leave." Caspian looked at Belinda with some displeasure and snorted. "Farika, you three brothers can take a look at just what miraculous powers a great druid of the Druidic Order has. Kill him for me." Belinda didn't waste any words when she heard Caspian's words and immediately waved her hand, indicating for the three brothers to kill Caspian. Farika and his brothers looked at each other under Belinda's orders, dark killing intent appearing on their faces. They each took out 3 long swords and surrounded Caspian. "Since you won't listen to my advice, then don't blame me." Caspian glared angrily at the three and took out a strange staff that looked like an old tree root from his space ring, planning to deal with the three. At this moment, the flying bugs that were the size of flies all over the small inn seemed to be driven by some sort of power as they all gathered towards Belinda's room. At the same time, the lush branches of a large tree beside the room were also drawn by some sort of power as the twisted branches slithered into the room like snakes. Chapter 166. Up on the roof, Han Shaw could clearly see the changes happening below through a long and narrow crack. The flying bugs the size of flies had gathered in this room from within the hotel, all of them congregating around Belinda. The soft branches of the surrounding trees spread madly in all directions after landing in the room. Great Druid Caspian of the Druidic Order held a staff that looked like a tree root, exuding a strong life force. "What are you waiting for?" Belinda suddenly snorted lightly at this moment. Farika and his brothers, who had surrounded Caspian, attacked Caspian almost simultaneously as soon as Belinda's words sounded out. The tip of Farika's long sword suddenly shot out crackling lightning after the three of them made their moves. One of the other two's long swords whistled through the air with extreme speed, while the last one ignited with raging flames and swept towards Caspian. Han Shoror, who was on the roof, was immediately taken aback by the three's actions. Han Shoror immediately identified Farika and his brothers from the changes in their longswords. They were actually magic swordsmen who trained in both martial arts and magic. Farika should have also trained in thunder magic, while the other two trained in wind and fire magic respectively. The three long swords looked like they'd been forged in a special way. They could directly imbue thunder, fire, and wind magic into their longswords when they attacked, increasing the power and speed of their techniques. This was quite a deterrent. It's three magic swordsmen, no wonder you're so arrogant. Caspian suddenly snorted coldly when they attacked, and when he opened his mouth to speak, he was still waving the magic staff in his hand. The snake-like branches that had been madly spreading through the room really did seem like long, flexible snakes. Dozens of branches lashed out at Farika and his brothers like long whips. At the same time, Caspian took a step back and picked up the unconscious Angelica. He suddenly leapt out of the window and landed on a nearby tree. The twining branches were shockingly nimble under Caspian's control. They seemed to know martial arts and could even dodge the slashes of the three magic swords. Caspian retreated to the top of the tree, a benevolent expression on his face as he raised his root-like magic staff and chanted a spell. The tree he was standing on suddenly came to life like a giant octopus. The lush branches suddenly became like countless tentacles of the octopus. With a very fast speed, they all spread into the house and swept towards everyone inside. Rise! A low cry came from Caspian's mouth. With a loud rumble, the house that Belinda and the others were in suddenly uprooted from the ground. Then, with a loud rumble, the beams of the house collapsed. Han Shoror, who was lying on the floor, stared at Emily in the room. He planned to rush down and rescue Emily if anything went wrong. However, what comforted Han Shoror was that the countless soft branches that had spread into the house had already entangled everyone apart from Belinda's group of 4 under Caspian's control. When the house collapsed, the soft, snake-like branches had already carried all the people who'd fainted from Belinda's sleeping powder out of the room. Friend on the roof, it's time for you to come down. When Han Shoror discovered that Emily had been pulled out of the house by the soft branches and was about to take the opportunity to leave, Caspian's bright eyes fell on Han Shoror and he spoke with a slight smile. Seeing that he'd been exposed, Han Shoror didn't continue to hide. He leapt out of the collapsed room and landed in the spacious courtyard of the hotel. He then walked easily to the large tree that Caspian was in and stood next to Emily and Candace. Do what you need to do, I'll keep an eye on these people for you. I won't let them harm the people under the tree. Han Shoror looked up at Caspian in the sky and smiled faintly. Caspian was taken aback when he heard Han Shoror's words. He couldn't help but look at Han Shoror oddly, asking in surprise, "Have we met before? Why does your voice sound so familiar?" "Heh, send those people away first." Belinda and the other 3 suddenly rushed out of the collapsed house at this moment. They immediately glared angrily at Caspian and attacked him. "All right, I think I'll definitely recognize you." Caspian responded and waved the magic staff that looked like the roots of a tree, treating Farika and his brothers with a face full of caution. The lush branches of the large tree above their heads continuously entangled, appearing abnormally large and powerful. The other trees in the courtyard seemed to be drawn by the power of nature and also began to wave their branches, joining in with Caspian's team. Han Shoror was quite surprised to see this. Han Shoror raised his head and saw that Caspian seemed to be able to deal with these people. He lowered his head and turned his attention to the unconscious Emily. Taking a deep breath, Han Shoror put a hand on Emily's back and circulated his magical yuan, forming a small whirlpool in his left palm. Han Shoror calmed his mind and used the wonders of the magical yuan and Han Shoror's understanding of the body to expel the sleeping fragrance that Emily had inhaled from her body in a short amount of time. Her long eyelashes suddenly fluttered, and Han Shoror was overjoyed. He knew that Emily was about to wake up. An enormous roar suddenly sounded in Han Shoror's ears, and the startled Han Shoror jerked his head up to discover that a 4 to 5 meter tall 3-eyed monster had appeared in the courtyard. It had 8 horns on its head, and a barbed tail covered in spikes. Han Shoror recognized this 4 to 5 meter tall three-eyed monster with just one look. It was the appearance of the three-eyed demon god, Ansadesi, that necromancer Clarendon had tried to summon last time. Right now, this three-eyed evil godlike monster was covered in shining grayish-brown iron armor. Its huge body was filled with power, giving off a strong sense of deterrence. A golem in the shape of an evil god, you're from the Calamity Church? Caspian's expression changed greatly when he saw the golem that looked like Ansadesi appear, and he cried out in shock. You've guessed correctly, Belinda said softly and pointed at Caspian, instructing the golem, kill him. The 4 to 5 meter tall golem made from grey metal armor charged directly at Caspian under Belinda's orders. A large tree in the surroundings furiously sprouted branches to wrap around the golem's ankles. However, before the branches could completely wrap around the golem's ankles, the extremely valiant-looking golem suddenly exerted force and broke the soft branches that had wrapped around its ankles. With each step, the three-eyed evil godlike puppet beast stomped heavily on the ground, creating a loud rumbling sound, as if an earthquake was approaching. Many slender branches from a nearby tree twisted together, turning into a branch that was thicker than 2 people's waists and fiercely smashed towards the golem. When the golem saw that the attack was upon it, its barbed tail covered in spikes swept out and slammed into the thick branch with a bang. The originally ferocious branch was struck by the golem's armored tail, and the barbs on its tail pierced deeply into the tree trunk. The thick branch was also broken off from the tree with a violent flick of the golem's arm, and then broke into a pile of broken branches that fell to the ground. A series of profound magical incantations suddenly came out of Emily's mouth, and a few dark magic spells suddenly fell on the golem. However, the dark magic spells that were highly destructive to humans and beasts didn't have any effect on the golem. The golems in the shape of evil gods that the Calamity Church's alchemists have developed all have strong magic immunity. Don't waste your efforts. Caspian looked down at Emily and reminded her. What do we do? Emily looked up at Caspian and asked urgently. Take these innocent people and leave immediately. I'll think of a way to tie them down. Caspian was also very anxious as he looked down and immediately responded. The golem is being manipulated by someone. As long as we can restrain the manipulator, everything will be over. Han Shoror suddenly said coldly at this moment. That is indeed the case, but that woman has 3 magical swordsmen protecting her, and the golem is also attacking us. It's not very realistic to restrain her. The golem in the shape of the three-eyed demon god had already arrived as they spoke. Caspian waved his magic staff as he spoke, manipulating the tree beneath him to intercept the golem. Emily, protect the people under the tree. Caspian, intercept the golem. Leave the woman to me. Han Shoror snorted coldly and rushed over like lightning as soon as the words left his mouth. His target was the female alchemist Belinda in the middle of the 3 magical swordsmen. Chapter 167. Careful. Emily called out worriedly when she saw Han Shoror rush out. The hotel's courtyard was the size of a basketball court. With Han Shoror's swift speed, he'd already appeared in the corner where Belinda and the others were standing almost as soon as Emily spoke. But as soon as Han Shoror moved, Farika and his brothers understood Han Shoror's intentions and had already surrounded Belinda, who was controlling the golem, in the center. Farika and his brothers surrounded Belinda from 3 different directions, all 6 eyes focused on Han Shoror's body warily. They gripped their magical swords tightly in their hands as they waited for Han Shoror to arrive. Han Shoror chanted the dark mist spell in a low voice as he charged forward. When Han Shoror appeared next to the 4, the dark mist spell was immediately released, enveloping Han Shoror, Belinda, and the others within. Damn it, he's a necromancer, Farika cursed. The magic sword in his hand suddenly shot out glaring lightning, illuminating the dark surroundings so that they could see clearly. 2 zombie warriors and Little Skull with the bone dagger suddenly appeared in the dark mist at Han Shoror's summons. Under Han Shoror's incantation, the 2 zombie warriors and Little Skull attacked Farika and his brothers at the same time. Even with the illumination of the lightning, the area covered by the dark mist couldn't be seen clearly, especially now that it was the middle of the night. As the caster, Han hid in the darkness and paced back and forth around Farika and his brothers like a ghost. He wasn't in a hurry to immediately attack. The two zombie warriors were immediately dealt a devastating blow when they neared Farika and his brothers. The person with the fire magical sword chopped away a zombie warrior's wooden club with the scorching heat of his sword, and the zombie warrior was instantly engulfed in flames. As for the swordsman who had mastered wind magic, his body was very agile. The speed at which he swung his magic sword was so fast that it was dazzling. In the blink of an eye, a dozen swords had already landed on the other zombie warrior's body. In an extremely short period of time, that zombie warrior had also lost the ability to fight. At the same time, two bone spears pierced through the air, aiming straight for the elder Farika. Little Skull also brandished his bone knife and stabbed at Farika. To Farika, the bone spears were obviously more of a threat than the Little Skull wielding the bone knife. As soon as he heard the sound of the bone spears, he immediately focused all his attention on the direction of the sound and struck out with his sword. A bolt of lightning flashed through the darkness and the two bone spears were both struck down. Suddenly, the Little Skull that had been moving as sluggishly as a normal skeletal warrior suddenly shot out with shocking speed, the bone dagger stabbing towards Farika's chest. "Be careful." Belinda had been manipulating the golem on the side and immediately screamed out in warning when she suddenly discovered the abnormality. Farika started in fright and tried to block again, but it was already too late. He immediately dodged in a flurry, but a large chunk of flesh had still been sliced through his chest. He grimaced in pain. The Demon Slayer Edge's shrill howl suddenly sounded. The Demon Slayer Edge revealed a hair-raising red in the darkness as it quickly wove through Farika's three brothers. Two soft sounds rang out, like the sound of a stick piercing through wallpaper. The other two who'd just finished off the two zombie warriors didn't know what was going on when they suddenly felt a chill in their chests. They looked down and saw a bloody hole in their chests, fresh blood spurting out like arrows. Two thuds sounded out as the two who'd looked down to see the bloody hole in their chests fell to the ground with a thud. On the other side, Caspian had been in a bit of a dangerous situation due to Belinda's distraction when he discovered that the golem's movements had suddenly slowed down. He immediately waved his staff and once again wrapped the tree branches around the golem. Under the tree, Emily took out her magic staff as her gaze moved back and forth between the golem and Han, seeming to observe the danger on the other side. "Don't kill her, it's best if you capture her." The Demon Slayer Edge's shrill howl became more and more piercing after being stained with the blood of the two magical swordsmen. In the distance, Emily couldn't help but exclaim softly when she saw a wisp of red swimming through the darkness towards Belinda, as if it was going to kill her next time. If it wasn't for Emily's reminder, the Demon Slayer Edge would have reaped Belinda's life in the next moment. Han immediately understood Belinda's intentions when he heard Emily's soft exclamation. With a thought, the Demon Slayer Edge flew back and landed in his hand in the blink of an eye. Farika, who'd escaped one of Little Skull's bone daggers, was in great pain from the stabbing pain in his chest. However, this pain was only temporary. Just as he'd dodged, the 7 blood-red bone spurs on Little Skull's back suddenly shot out and nailed him to the ground. The 7 blood-red bone spurs sparkled with an eerie red light as the blood on Farika's body quickly flowed into the 7 bone spurs. All of Farika's blood had been sucked away by the 7 bone spurs in an exceedingly short amount of time. His body shriveled up like a large piece of dried meat. As the 7 bone spurs sucked away his blood, Little Skull seemed to be enjoying it immensely. He held the bone dagger in his hand and danced with joy, making Belinda feel an irrepressible sense of fear. "Don't move." Belinda suddenly heard a cold, harsh voice from behind her in the darkness. She then saw the strange weapon that had reaped the lives of 2 of her subordinates pressed against her neck. "Who are you, that you dare interfere in the matters of the Calamity Church?" Belinda didn't reveal any signs of panic as her sapphire eyes looked straight ahead. Her tone was still gentle as she spoke faintly. "Cut the crap and stop the golem's movements immediately, or you'll die right now." Clarendon had already been killed, and it was certain that Han and the Calamity Church had formed a grudge. Han was now completely lawless and unrestrained in his actions. Why would he care about the Calamity Church's threats? Belinda felt that Hanshuro wasn't joking at all from his cold tone and the killing intent emanating from the demon slayer edge. After muttering to herself for a moment, Belinda said, "You'll definitely regret provoking us." Belinda controlled the golem with some unknown method as she spoke. The 4 to 5 meter tall armored golem actually disappeared into a strange magic scroll in Belinda's hand. Hanshuro used a bit of force to hit the back of Belinda's head, causing her body to go limp, and she immediately fainted. The little skull's 7 bone spurs had drained all the blood from Farika's body and returned them to Farika's spine. The dark mist was gradually thinning at this point. Hanshuro saw that the outcome was set and also withdrew the little skull. Taking a deep breath, Hanshuro grabbed Belinda by the waist and clamped her between his wrists, walking out of the area to Emily's side. "Let's go, I'll leave the rest to Elder Caspian." Hanshuro lifted his head to look at Caspian and laughed lightly. Since the golem had disappeared, Caspian naturally had no more misgivings. He looked at Hanshuro with great surprise when he heard Hanshuro's words, "Just who are you? How do you know I'm called Caspian? Have we met before?" "Heh, we have indeed met before, but we're not familiar with each other." The people here are all innocent. They have only been drugged by the incense. Even without your help, they will slowly wake up. We need to take this person from the Calamity Church away for questioning, so we won't be staying here any longer. Hanshuro smiled as he looked at Caspian. "No, this woman is from the Calamity Church. If today's matters aren't handled well, it'll bring you great trouble. I think it's more appropriate for you to hand her over to me. I'll take care of this matter." Caspian seemed a bit unwilling when he heard that Hanshuro and Caspian wanted to take Belinda away. He landed from the tree and spoke to Hanshuro. "Our dark mantle has already interfered with the matters of the Calamity Church. It's not your place to ask." Emily, who'd been silent all this time, suddenly looked at Caspian with displeasure and said with a scowl. Caspian started when he heard these words and then nodded in realization. "So you're from the dark mantle? Since that's the case, then there's no problem. You can take the woman away, I'll guarantee the safety of everyone here." "Then I'll thank you very much." Hanshuro was picking up Farika and the other two's magic swords as he spoke, and also looting the items on their bodies. "Let's go, don't look anymore, there's nothing left." Emily rolled her eyes at Hanshuro, seemingly amused at Hanshuro's greed. "If this woman wakes up, explain to her what happened so she doesn't become overly suspicious." Hanshuro pointed at Candace on the ground and left with Emily, returning to the Dark Mantle stronghold. Chapter 168. While Hanshuro and Emily were leading Belinda towards the Dark Mantle base, a flying insect the size of a housefly that had been circling the hotel was following Hanshuro and Emily from afar. The Demon Slayer edge suddenly flashed and pierced a flying insect with its sharp tip, bringing it to Hanshuro's palm. Upon closer inspection, Hanshuro discovered that this flying insect had the same appearance as the golem that Belinda had released. They were both forged from metal armor, the only difference being that one was extremely large while the other was extremely small. Magical yuan circulated in his palm and Hanshuro's thumb and index finger squeezed tightly. A crisp crack rang out as the flying insect was crushed. Hanshuro's eyes narrowed as he discovered that there was an extremely small magical matrix within the stomach of the crushed flying insect. There was a faintly discernible existence of magical elements within. This Calamity Church is a bit miraculous, all right, to be able to set up a magical matrix within such a small flying insect golem. Hanshuro couldn't help but sigh emotionally as he put away the flying insect golem. Nodding, Emily was very much in agreement with Hanshuro's words. She said with lingering fear, "The Calamity Church is the most evil of all churches. They have all sorts of evil magic and secret arts within them. Look at this golem that looks like an evil god today. If we could mass produce them, then our empire's cavalry wouldn't even have the slightest chance of resisting the charge of these armored golems." As expected of someone who'd been influenced by the Dark Mantle, Emily's first thought was still the safety of the Empire. She didn't consider what benefits these golems could bring her. "I'll take care of these flying insect golems first so that they don't follow us all the way to the Dark Mantle base. It'll be bad if we're discovered." Han Shoror activated the Demon Slayer Edge and used his mind to control it to charge into the center of the flying insect golems, destroying all of them in the blink of an eye. After the small golems were destroyed, Han Shoror and Emily didn't linger and returned to the Dark Mantle base in the dead of the night. In the secret room that Han Shoror had stayed in 2 days ago, Han Shoror had placed Belinda on a chair and had Emily tie her to the chair with ropes. The unconscious Belinda's hands and feet were tied to the chair and she couldn't feel anything at all. She was at Emily's mercy. When Emily had tied her up, she couldn't help but look at the veil covering Belinda's face. She asked in confusion, "Why does this girl keep her face veiled? Is there something wrong with her?" Shrugging his shoulders, Han Shoror smiled and said, "There are only 3 possibilities for a woman to wear a veil on her face. Either she's too beautiful and is afraid that her appearance will put her in danger, or it's because of the special customs of some races, or there's a flaw on her face that she doesn't want others to see. I'm also very curious which one this woman belongs to, but she's our prisoner now. I think you can take off her veil and take a look." Emily couldn't help but glare at her when she heard Han Shoror's words. She spoke in a strange tone, "Oh, I didn't know that you know so much about veils and whether women wear them or not." Han Shoror laughed involuntarily and hastened to explain, "This has nothing to do with me. It's because I received Clarendon's memories that I know about this." Snorting lightly, Emily didn't say anything else. She reached out and grabbed the veil covering Belinda's face, slowly pulling it down. The unconscious Belinda's completely unconcealed features were gradually revealed. Slender crescent brows lined her smooth forehead, and long eyelashes covered her tightly shut eyes. With Emily's actions, Belinda's tall and straight nose was slowly revealed. Her skin was fair and clear, and she was a stunning silhouette no matter how one looked at it. It was a pity that when the veil was completely removed, Han Shoror and Emily suddenly saw a dark blue birthmark on Belinda's left cheek. This dark blue birthmark appeared on Belinda's left cheek, making her originally beautiful face look a bit sinister and frightening. You guessed correctly, she does have a natural defect. If it wasn't for this dark blue birthmark, this woman would be a great beauty through and through. What a pity. Emily looked Belinda up and down and spoke to Han Shoror with some regret after pulling down Belinda's veil. Oval cheeks, a high nose bridge, rosy lips, slender crescent brows, and a pair of starry eyes that shone like sapphires. She also had fair and clear skin, and a lithe and graceful figure. These were all characteristics that a beauty should have. It was a pity that the dark blue birthmark on her left cheek was too eye-catching. Anyone who saw it would focus most of their attention on it. This immediately formed a strong contrast and completely destroyed a beauty. "All right, I've woken her up." Han Shoror's expression was the same as usual, and he didn't particularly care about this woman's beauty or ugliness. He walked behind the chair and placed a hand on the back of her neck, squeezing the tendons there with a bit of force. He then patted her right cheek and called out, "You're awake." Belinda's skin was smooth and silky. When Han Shoror had woken her up, it was quite comfortable to the touch when he pinched her smooth skin. It was as if he was touching expensive silk. Belinda's long eyelashes fluttered a few times when she heard Han Shoror's actions. Her clear, starry eyes opened and she first looked around in confusion, then looked at Emily and Han Shoror with surprise. The confusion in her eyes immediately faded as Belinda quickly recognized the situation she was in. A cold light flashed through her clear eyes, but her voice was still soft and threatening. "Who are you to dare capture me? Our Calamity Church will not let you off. You will regret what you've done today. You don't need to worry about that. Just what is your Calamity Church's purpose in appearing in Valin City this time? Apart from assassinating Clark, what other schemes do you have?" Emily looked coldly at Belinda and interrogated her. "Do you think I'll tell you? I think you're wasting your efforts." Belinda looked disdainfully at Emily and said mockingly. Belinda suddenly thought of something when she saw the veil in Emily's hand. Her gentle voice became sharp for the first time as she glared angrily at Emily with a bit of panic. She said loudly, "You'll pay the price for taking off my veil." Han Shoror watched for a while and walked up to Belinda with a bit of impatience. He said in a cold voice, "Tell me your objective this time or I'll leave a large mark on your tender right cheek." Belinda's expression changed when she heard these words, and then she giggled loudly. "You'll pay the price." Belinda's ruddy face suddenly paled, and her body stiffened in an extremely short amount of time. Even her breathing became very slow. When she closed her eyes, she seemed to have fainted again, and all the functions of her body seemed to enter a dormant state. Han Shoror, who'd been prepared to torture a confession, was flabbergasted. He smiled wryly at Emily and said, "She seems to have taken some kind of medicine and suddenly fainted again. This method of fainting through medicine is a bit troublesome. What do you think we should do?" Emily came over and cast a dark magic into Belinda's body. Emily then closed her eyes and thought for a bit. She could only shake her head and sigh lowly. "The Calamity Church is a bit difficult to deal with, all right. She's fainted so suddenly. No amount of torture will work if we don't wake her up. What do you think we should do?" Han Shoror spread out his hands and retreated, speaking helplessly to Emily. After thinking for a bit, Emily responded, "I'll first report this matter to the higher-ups and see what decision they make. In addition, notify the forest troll that the siege equipment that can be sold to merchants seems to have been secretly transported to Valin City. I need to go out and see if I can find any concrete evidence." "Then, what should I do?" Han Shoror asked. "Heh, there's nothing for you to do for now. Do whatever you want. I'll notify you immediately if anything happens." Emily looked at Han Shoror with a smile. Nodding, Han Shoror said, "That's fine as well. I'll stay in this secret room and start studying advanced necromancy magic. In addition, I'll see if I can find a way to wake this Belinda up and get some information out of her." Emily was about to leave when she suddenly thought of something and turned back to glare at Han Shoror. "That's up to you. But behave yourself and don't take advantage of my absence to eat Belinda. I'm not the type of person to take advantage of others when they're down, don't worry." Han Shoror smiled wryly. "TMPH, you're still denying it. How would I have fallen for you if you weren't this type of person?" Emily glared fiercely at Han Shoror and then thought of something. She chuckled. "However, that dark blue birthmark on Belinda's face will probably affect your mood. I don't think I have anything to worry about." After saying that, Emily seemed to be a little pleased with herself. She chuckled and left the place at ease. Chapter 169. Due to Han Shoror's advancement to the true demon realm, not only had his magical yuan advanced by leaps and bounds in recent times, but Han Shoror's mental strength had also advanced by leaps and bounds due to the strengthening of his brain. Han Shoror had already become proficient in the few spells that should be grasped in journeyman necromancy magic. After obtaining all of Clarendon's memories, Han Shoror's understanding of necromancy magic had taken a large step forward. Han Shoror had directly obtained many difficult and abstruse magical knowledge through Clarendon's decades of experience, and his progress in magic was tremendous. Now, Han Shoror could feel that his mental strength was even stronger than before. Since he had grasped all journeyman magics, Han Shoror planned on advancing to the next level. His agreement with Fanny was that he would only be able to officially date her after he became an adept mage. This was a very strong motivation for Han Shoror. Taking advantage of his free time, Han Shoror stayed in the Dark Mantle's secret room and continued to meditate and comprehend Clarendon's understanding of advanced magic. After Han Shoror's repeated practice and grasped the advanced magic of Acid Bog, Han Shoror felt that he had used up too much of his mental strength and temporarily stopped practicing. At this moment, Han Shoror's eyes swiveled as he stared at Belinda, who had fainted from the potion. His thoughts raced as Han Shoror involuntarily walked to Belinda's side. After thinking for a moment, Han Shoror put a hand on Belinda's back and circulated his magical yuan. A thread of magical yuan slowly entered Belinda's body. It was because of the cruel training of his body and the repeated reforging of it that Han Shoror had become very familiar with the structure of the human body. Han Shoror focused his attention as the magical yuan entered Belinda's body. He could feel the trajectory of the magical yuan circulation. When Han Shoror calmed his mind and began to do this, he quickly discovered that there was a numbing potion in Belinda's body. It was like an anesthetic that could stimulate a person's nerves and make them lose consciousness in an instant, making it difficult for them to wake up. When Han Shoror sensed the effects of this medicine, he calmed his mind and slowly circulated his magical yuan through Belinda's body. The magical yuan absorbed the medicine and slowly gathered it in Han Shoror's palm. As he was doing this, Han Shoror suddenly saw the dark blue birthmark on Belinda's left cheek. His heart moved. Han Shoror's magical yuan flowed into the birthmark. When the magical yuan entered, Han Shoror could clearly feel that there was another strange substance within the dark green birthmark. However, this substance had completely melded with the skin of Belinda's face, so it would be a bit troublesome to extract it. After all, this kind of dark blue birthmark should have been fused with Belinda's face since birth, unlike the unconscious medicine that had entered her body in a very short amount of time. Although there was a way, Belinda's beauty had nothing to do with him. In addition, doing this would expend a lot of his magical yuan, so Han Shoror naturally wouldn't help Belinda with her beauty. When the anesthetic in Belinda's body was almost completely absorbed, Han Shoror knew that she would wake up soon. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way to interrogate the awakened Belinda. An idea suddenly floated into his mind and Han Shoror chuckled coldly. A ball of purple flame danced on the fingertip of his left hand, and he used the Demon Slayer edge to cut open his index finger, dripping a drop of blood into the little purple flame. When this drop of Han Shoror's blood landed on the purple flame, the little ball of purple flame suddenly flared with blinding light and then shrank to the size of a pinky fingernail. Under Han Shoror's mental manipulation, this little ball of purple flame abruptly sank into the back of Belinda's neck, becoming a small black mole. Having reached the true demon realm in magical cultivation, Han Shoror could use secret demonic arts to form a mysterious connection with the blood essence within his body. Using a secret method, Han Shoror had sealed a cloud of mystical frost within the drop of blood essence. Through this drop of blood essence, Han Shoror could use the demon infant to control the degree of coldness of the mystical frost. As long as Han Shoror was willing, the demon infant could activate the blood essence and allow the mystical frost to invade Belinda's body, instantly dictating her life and death. In addition, within a certain distance, Han Shoror could also sense Belinda's location through this drop of blood essence. Because of the loss of a drop of blood essence, Han Shoror knew that Belinda would wake up in a short amount of time after doing all this. He made good use of the time and sat down cross-legged nearby, silently circulating his magical yuan to quickly recover. The blood essence was near the demon infant and existed to nourish it. Every drop contained the magical yuan that Han Shoror had trained so hard. Some special magical arts required blood essence as a primer. Blood essence was just as important to a demonic practitioner as the demon infant. One wouldn't easily lose too much blood essence. Otherwise, it would cause the demonic arts to regress at best, or cause one to go berserk at worst, destroying both body and soul. However, the loss of a drop of blood essence naturally wouldn't cause any serious problems. As long as one trained diligently, one would be able to completely recover in a day. A soft hum suddenly sounded from the side after a while. Han Shoror, who had been meditating in silence, could sense that Belinda was awakening even with his eyes closed. Her long eyelashes fluttered, and her bright eyes began to take in her surroundings. There were a few lamps burning on the walls of the secret room, so Belinda could clearly see everything when she looked around. Apart from being sufficiently spacious, there weren't any special decorations in the secret room. Han Shoror, who was sitting indifferently in a remote corner, immediately drew all of Belinda's attention. Han Shoror had a solemn expression on his face. His handsome face was chiseled, and he sat coldly with his back ramrod straight. He looked extremely masculine. Pouting, Belinda exhaled softly and tugged at the ropes on her body. She discovered that it would be very difficult to free herself from them. Her quick-witted eyes darted back and forth, as if contemplating something. "You'd better not act rashly. Otherwise, I'll immediately kill you if I notice anything amiss." Still sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed, Han Shoror spoke with a cold face when he heard the sound of the rope rubbing against each other. Han Shoror's sudden words startled Belinda. She glared angrily at Han Shoror and said, "Just who are you? What enmity does the Calamity Church have with you? Why do you have to hold me captive?" Taking a deep breath, Han Shoror opened his deep eyes and flicked a glance at Belinda. He took out the white bone staff that he'd obtained from Clarendon from his space ring and said faintly, "Alchemist Belinda of the Calamity Church, work number 17. You personally refined this white bone staff. I obtained it from Clarendon after killing him. It's very useful, I have to thank you. So it was you who killed Clarendon. It looks like you're one of Griffin Legion Commander Bob Asher's men." Belinda's gaze first focused on the white bone staff and landed on Hanshaw after a while. Shaking his head, Hanshaw responded, "I'm not a member of the Griffin Legion. On the contrary, I have some history with them. If it wasn't for my help when Clarendon tried to assassinate Clark, Clark might not have died. It was just that Claude killed everyone he saw, and I accidentally saw him summon the three-eyed demon god Ansidesi. He wanted to kill me, so I had no choice but to retaliate." "You're really not one of Bob Asher's men?" Belinda was first quite surprised when she heard Hanshaw say that he wasn't a member of the Griffin Legion and then hurriedly questioned Hanshaw. "Of course, you're my prisoner now. There's no need for me to lie to you at this time." Hanshaw nodded his head affirmatively and said lowly, "You said just now that you tried to assassinate Clark. This means that you're also enemies with Bob Asher." Belinda's usually gentle voice grew a bit high-pitched as she looked at Hanshaw and asked urgently, clearly a bit excited. Nodding his head again, Hanshaw responded with a slight smile, "That's right. To be precise, Clark died by my hands and not Clarendon. I've come to Valen City this time to deal with Bob Asher." "That's wonderful. Since our goals are the same, I think we shouldn't be enemies. The Griffin Legion is so large in Valen City, I think it'll be easier for us to achieve our goals if we work together." Belinda's face was full of joy as she looked at Hanshaw with great interest. "But I killed Clarendon and 3 of your Calamity Church's magical swordsmen just now. What should we do?" Although Hanshaw had long since made up his mind, he was still a bit surprised to hear Belinda speak so readily. Sacrifices are unavoidable in order to achieve anything. A few deaths are no big deal. As long as we work together to deal with the Griffin Legion, I promise that we can forget our past enmity. Belinda spoke very carelessly, not caring at all about the lives of her own people. Hanshaw was a bit surprised by this attitude of disregarding her own people, but seeing that his goals had been achieved, he chuckled. "If that's the case, then that's wonderful." Chapter 170. When Emily returned to the secret room and saw that Hanshaw and Belinda were chatting cheerfully and wittily, she was flabbergasted. Her shifty eyes roamed over Hanshaw and Belinda and finally pulled Hanshaw over to ask suspiciously, "You didn't really sleep with her, did you?" Hanshaw didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he quickly shook his head and explained, "Of course not. Miss Belinda's target is also the commander of the Griffin Legion. Miss Belinda can completely disregard our previous conflicts and is willing to work with us to deal with Bob Asher. I feel that it's beneficial for both sides to work together, so I agreed." "You agreed just like that and even released her restraints?" Emily was stunned as she stared at Hanshaw. Casting a glance at Emily, Hanshaw smiled calmly and said to Belinda, "This place is a bit special. Although we can work together, there should still be some secrets between us. If Miss Belinda doesn't mind, I'd like to blindfold you and let you go." "Of course, I completely understand." Belinda was quite straightforward and agreed without the slightest bit of hesitation. He covered Belinda's eyes again and put her veil back on as well. Hanshaw took Belinda away from the dark mantle stronghold under Emily's astonished gaze and took a carriage to a faraway place before letting Belinda alight. He said, "When you've contacted your people, you can find us at the place we agreed upon. We can then discuss the details of our cooperation in detail." I'm very happy to meet you," Belinda said gently and left the carriage. Emily hastily asked as soon as Belinda's figure had left, "What's going on? Why did you let her go just like that?" After quickly explaining the situation, Hanshaw said to Emily, "Forcing her to confess may not be effective, but if we let her go like this, we can obtain more useful information. If she does anything harmful to us, I can immediately take her life with a thought, so you don't have to worry about anything. She'll ask for help from the Calamity Church after she leaves. Only by cooperating with them will we be able to obtain more useful information and join forces to deal with Bob Asher." Isn't this killing two birds with one stone? Do you know that what you are doing is extremely dangerous? The Calamity Church is different from ordinary forces. If we are not careful, not only will all our previous efforts be in vain, we may even pay with our lives. You are playing with fire. After listening to Han Shor's explanation, Emily still couldn't let it go and said with a sigh, all right. I know what I'm doing. Sometimes, it's necessary to take risks out of desperation. Only when there's a big crisis will there be a big opportunity. We can handle it. At this point, Han Shor paused and asked Emily, right, you went out just now, did you obtain any useful information? That Phoebe who brought you to the finance minister's banquet arrived in Valin City the day before yesterday. You definitely can't imagine why she's here. Emily creased her brow when she saw that Han Shor was asking about serious matters. Starting, Han Shor asked Emily with some surprise, what is she doing in Valin City? Because of the McGrady Merchant Guild's failure last time, Asher didn't continue to trust them and found Phoebe. As the owner of the Boot Merchant Guild, Bob Asher promised to transport that batch of siege equipment at a high price. Unbeknownst to her, she was enticed by the high interest and used her Merchant Guild's channels to avoid a few towns and deliver the equipment to Valin City. Who would have thought that she'd actually succeed? She's already arrived in Valin City with the equipment. If there aren't any accidents, it'll be delivered to the Griffin Legion tomorrow. Emily smiled ruefully as she explained. Han Shor's mind raced when these words were spoken and he suddenly said, then will Phoebe be implicated in this matter? That's hard to say. If she knows what this batch of equipment is and still insists on helping Bob Asher, then even I will find it hard to cover up this matter. But if she doesn't know anything and has been completely kept in the dark by Bob Asher, then there's still room to maneuver. Emily thought for a moment and responded to Han Shor. Where does Phoebe live right now? I need to go see her immediately. Han Shor's brow furrowed as he stared at Emily and asked lowly. Pouting, Emily glared at Han Shor and said huffily, and you say that you have nothing to do with her? You don't know how worried you are when you hear that she's in danger. I need her to help me with a lot of my materials. Can't anything happen to her? Hurry up and tell me her address. Han Shor hugged Emily and forcefully kissed her, smiling cheekily as he begged. Snorting lightly, Emily pinched Han Shor fiercely before telling him Phoebe's address. When she saw that Han Shor was about to leave, she couldn't help but remind, there are soldiers of the Griffin Legion guarding the hotel that Emily lives in. You must be careful and don't let anything happen to you. Thank you for your concern. I'll take good care of myself even if it's for you. Han Shor chuckled lightly and shot out of the carriage like a cheetah, heading swiftly for Phoebe's hotel. The hotel that Phoebe lived in was on a street that had just entered the city. When Han Shor arrived, he discovered that there were indeed many soldiers of the Griffin Legion in the surroundings. It looked like they were very concerned about the items that Phoebe was transporting. It was already the latter half of the night and the sky would probably brighten soon. This was the time when one was the most sleepy. Han Shor noticed that the soldiers responsible for guarding the hotel were all involuntarily dozing off. Their mental states weren't very good. Taking advantage of the night, Han Shor deployed the art of the demonic ninth heavens and flew into the air. From an extremely high altitude, he slowly landed on the roof of the hotel. It had to be said that the Dark Mantle's information network was powerful. Not only had Emily been able to find out where Phoebe was staying as soon as she'd entered the city, she'd even investigated which room she was staying in. The last room on the west side was the most secluded and also the most expensive room in the hotel. There were 3 Griffin Legion soldiers standing guard around it. Han Shor landed on the roof and observed for a bit. Taking advantage of one of the people dozing off, he used the hidden force of his magical yuan to open a window from the inside and snuck in without a sound. This room was sufficiently spacious and had its own living room, bathroom, and bedroom. It was the time when people were sound asleep, so it was only natural that Phoebe would be in the bedroom. Han Shor held his breath and focused his mind as he quietly and slowly walked towards the bedroom, not making the slightest sound. There was a large, soft bed under a purple gauze canopy. The stove next to it was burning with charcoal, warming up the bedroom. A figure was lying on her side on the large, soft bed, wrapped in a thin silk blanket. Her long hair was scattered and her fair, bare shoulders were exposed. She was moaning softly as if she were dreaming. Silently walking to Phoebe's window, Hanshaw twisted his body and lifted the purple gauze canopy, moving closer to Phoebe. Hanshaw was just about to wake Phoebe up when he suddenly heard a low moan. He then heard Phoebe's fragrant lips softly murmur, "Oh, don't, big bad guy. Brian, you big bad guy." Hanshaw was startled and thought that Phoebe had discovered him. He couldn't help but climb up a bit to look at Phoebe, only to find that Phoebe's eyes were tightly shut and her cheeks were flushed with embarrassment. She was moaning softly, and a pair of hands under the thin blanket seemed to be rubbing his body. She was actually having a wet dream, and the male lead was actually him. Hanshaw was flabbergasted as he stared at Phoebe in shock. At this time, Phoebe's cheeks and neck were flushed. Her seductive tongue was gently licking her red cherry lips. Her hands were wandering between her chest and abdomen under the blanket. She was moaning softly and calling his name from time to time. Such a soul-stirring temptation was presented in front of him. Hanshaw only felt his mouth dry and his lower body immediately raised. Hanshaw, who originally planned to immediately wake Phoebe up, completely forgot about all the messy things at this time. His body slowly fell onto Phoebe's big bed, and he even lifted a corner of the blanket and burrowed in. From the back, he was lying on his side like Phoebe. Hanshaw's raised lower body directly penetrated into the curve of Phoebe's buttocks. Through the thin clothes, Hanshaw could even feel the wet and slippery curve of Phoebe's buttocks. This kind of strong stimulation, no man could withstand it. With a low gasp, Hanshaw reached out and climbed onto Phoebe's firm and full breasts from behind. He rubbed them through the thin silk clothes. His big mouth moved towards Phoebe's neck from behind. His fiery tongue licked and kissed Phoebe's white and blushing neck. "Oh, you big pervert." Phoebe, who was fast asleep, also clearly felt the strong stimulation. She couldn't help but moan. One of her hands subconsciously covered the hand that Hanshaw was wantonly invading her breasts. She brought Hanshaw's hand and took the initiative to wander around her own chest. On the other side, Phoebe's buttocks clearly felt the high contact. She couldn't help but clamp her slender legs together, as if she wanted to feel Hanshaw's invasion more clearly. This kind of ecstatic stimulation made Hanshaw gasp uncontrollably, and his kissing and licking of Phoebe became more intense. Just as the feeling of ecstasy was getting stronger and stronger, Phoebe suddenly twisted her neck and turned around to face Hanshaw. She opened her sleepy eyes and looked at Hanshaw, who had a look of enjoyment on his face. Chapter 171. Hanshaw was dumbfounded on the spot. His heart thumped wildly. He opened his mouth wide and didn't know what to do. No matter what, breaking into someone's boudoir in the middle of the night, climbing into someone's bed, and doing such an outrageous thing was unexplainable and unforgivable. The sleepy Phoebe stared at him in a daze. Hanshaw had already prepared himself for the onslaught of a violent storm. To Hanshaw's surprise, just when he didn't know what to do, Phoebe turned around and twisted her body to face Hanshaw. Then, she wrapped her snake-like arms around Hanshaw's neck. Her red lips moved towards Hanshaw's wide-open mouth. Her small, fragrant tongue, mixed with her smooth saliva, took the initiative to extend into Hanshaw's big mouth. When she faced Hanshaw like this, Phoebe's two long, slender legs also slid between Hanshaw's thighs, while her other warm, firm, beautiful leg rested on Hanshaw's thick waist. Her body started twisting like a snake. When Phoebe slept, she wore a thin, silky underwear. When the two of them were so close, this silky underwear was so close to their skin that it was almost useless. A perfect naked body was entangled in his body, and her fragrant tongue even took the initiative to let him taste it. Hanshaw forgot the panic just now and reacted enthusiastically. Two big hands put on Phoebe's upper chest and plump buttocks, rubbing them unceremoniously. He felt the smooth roundness. As his hands kept rubbing, Hanshaw's breathing became more and more intense. Finally, he couldn't bear it anymore and directly pressed Phoebe under his body. He tore apart Phoebe's thin underwear violently, and his big hands fell directly on Phoebe's bare full chest. "Ooh, it hurts." Phoebe cried out in pain and withdrew her tongue from Hanshaw's passionate entanglement. Her almond-shaped eyes gradually became a bit clearer. Hanshaw was stunned and couldn't help but pant heavily. "Sorry, I'll be gentler next." When these words left his mouth, Phoebe, who had been a bit confused, immediately blushed. She abruptly pushed Hanshaw away with exceptional fear and hurriedly pulled over the thin blanket to cover herself. She screamed, "You can talk, this isn't a dream." Hanshaw finally reacted when Phoebe said this. It looked like Phoebe had taken the initiative to kiss him just now because she hadn't completely woken up yet. She thought she was still in a dream. Under muddlehead circumstances, the entanglement of their bodies, Hanshaw's slightly rough movements, and his response finally caused Phoebe to instantly wake up. She also recognized the true situation, which was why she was so shocked. "Miss Phoebe, what's the matter?" Phoebe's shrill call attracted the attention of the 3 Griffin Legion guards patrolling outside. One of them stood in front of the door and asked, "No, nothing, just a nightmare. Don't worry about me, you guys just keep watch outside." Although Phoebe's expression was still quite frantic, she didn't even think twice before covering up the fact that Hanshaw was here when she heard the guards' calls. "Oh, it'll be daybreak in a while. Miss Phoebe, you can still rest for a while." The guard outside the door said this and continued to guard his post. Her face was a shocking red as Phoebe's eyes stared straight at Hanshaw. She didn't make a sound as she looked hatefully at Hanshaw. Her expression was quite odd. In this moment, Hanshaw was so embarrassed that he wanted to find a hole to hide in. Being stared at by Phoebe like this, even the thick-skinned Hanshaw couldn't help but blush. He began to explain incoherently, I had some matters to discuss with you, and then you were having a strange dream, and then you hugged me. I'm a normal man, so that. Hanshaw's explanation seemed very feeble. When he spoke like this, even Hanshaw himself felt somewhat ashamed. Therefore, when he said this, his momentum was much weaker, and it looked like the quibbling of a prisoner on death row. Phoebe, who stared deeply at Hanshaw, blushed more and more. Seeing Hanshaw frantically looking for an excuse at this time, she felt angry no matter how she looked at it. She couldn't help but yell in an unusually angry voice, "Shut up." As soon as this sentence came out, Hanshaw immediately shut up. He sat on the corner of the bed with a bitter smile and hung his head without saying a word. He looked like a child who had done something wrong and was waiting for the teacher to punish him. "You violated me so despicably while I was asleep. Brian, you're even more despicable and shameless than I thought." Phoebe glared angrily at Hanshaw and said hatefully, "I didn't, you hugged me first. To be exact, I was the passive one." Hanshaw hung his head and snuck a glance at Phoebe out of the corner of his eye, explaining in an aggrieved tone. "What?" Phoebe sobbed lowly. She pulled the thin blanket over her body with one hand and hammered Hanshaw's chest with the other. She cursed in a low voice as if she was crying, "You still dare say that? You despicable, shameless scoundrel. You've always treated me like this and never took responsibility. I hate you so much." Although Phoebe was hammering Hanshaw with such force, he didn't feel any pain at all due to the fact that she wasn't using any fighting aura, and Hanshaw's physical endurance was so great that he didn't feel any pain at all. Thinking furiously, Hanshaw thought back to how Phoebe had called out his name in her sleep. He thought back to how Phoebe had treated him in the past, and added to the words just now, he suddenly had a flash of inspiration and understood a fact: Phoebe liked him. Once he sorted out this matter, Hanshaw's mind spun even faster. However, even with Hanshaw's nimble mind, it wasn't that easy to find a reasonable solution to this matter. After a moment of silence, Hanshaw hardened his heart and decided that he might as well go all the way. He might as well force himself on her. Hanshaw, who was passively enduring Phoebe's hammering, suddenly grabbed Phoebe's small hand in a domineering manner. His other hand suddenly reached out and lifted the thin blanket that was wrapped around Phoebe and directly pressed down on Phoebe. A frantic kiss suddenly fell on Phoebe, fiercely licking and kissing her neck, cheeks, shoulders, and soft breasts. When Hanshaw was doing this, His heavy body pressed down on Phoebe, and his strong arms held her so that she couldn't move at all. She could only open her mouth and call out, let go of me, you bastard. Don't lick there, shut up, you bastard scoundrel, oh, don't. Curses and struggles continuously escaped from Phoebe's fragrant lips. However, because there were guards outside, Phoebe obviously didn't dare disturb them. She forcefully suppressed her cries and didn't have any effect on Hanshaw at all. Under Hanshaw's forceful kiss, Phoebe's soft cries became more and more urgent. Her cheeks became redder and redder, and her struggles became weaker and weaker. In the end, it turned into a low moan. Hanshaw suddenly had a carefree feeling and frantically licked and kissed Phoebe. Oh, why did you bite me? Suddenly, an enormous pain shot out from Hanshaw's mouth. She'd only been able to move her mouth, but when she saw that she couldn't struggle, she lifted her neck and bit down on Hanshaw's ear with her pearly white teeth. If you bite me, I'll bite you back. After biting Hanshaw, Phoebe's face was filled with a strange color. Her eyes were even brighter and seemed to contain a suppressed sweetness. Then, let's bite together. Hanshaw laughed lewdly. His mouth, which had been kissing Phoebe's neck and shoulder, suddenly moved towards Phoebe's cherry lips. Contrary to Hanshaw's expectations, Phoebe didn't struggle at all this time. Instead, she panted and welcomed him passionately. Her slippery little tongue took the initiative to enter Hanshaw's mouth and entangled with Hanshaw intensely. As soon as he sensed Phoebe's response, Hanshaw's heart fluttered, and his hands and feet started to become restless again. His large hands caressed Phoebe's plump and firm breasts, unrestrainedly rubbing them. His high-spirited lower body even more naughtily moved around Phoebe's body. With a soft "oh," Phoebe panted heavily and used all her strength to push Hanshaw away. She didn't dare to look at Hanshaw and said shyly, "All right, it's almost daybreak." Looking out the window, it was indeed daybreak. There were faint voices coming from outside. Thinking of Phoebe's safety, Hanshaw suppressed his desire and moved away from Phoebe's body. He gently covered Phoebe's perfect body with a thin blanket and then held her in his arms. When Hanshaw did this, a strong woman like Phoebe's eyes lit up. She seemed to be enjoying it very much. After Hanshaw finished doing all this, she lowered her head and said softly, "You violated me again today. What do you think I should do?" With a smirk, Hanshaw hugged Phoebe's body tightly and said domineeringly, "From now on, you are my woman." As soon as these words left her mouth, Phoebe's flushed cheeks shone with a strange luster. It was as if she had been waiting for this day, waiting for Hanshaw to say these words for a long time. Then, when the truth was right in front of her eyes, she appeared shy and unwilling. However, the sweetness on her face showed her joy. Her face lowered to her neck, Phoebe was very shy and obediently said in a mosquito-like voice, "En." Chapter 172. Perhaps it was because of the intimate touch, but the cold, proud, and noble Phoebe's delicate cheeks were often in a captivating red state when facing Hanshaw. Her attitude towards Hanshaw had also changed greatly. Women were like this. Before they'd opened their hearts, they'd always be apprehensive and reserved. However, once they'd set their minds on you and given their hearts to you, they'd involuntarily take the lead. Even a strong sword master like Phoebe was no exception. "Tell me, how did you know I was living here, and why did you sneak in?" Phoebe raised her head to look at Hanshaw with a slight smile as she asked, leaning on Hanshaw's broad chest. Taking a deep breath, Hanshaw's restless hands and feet all stopped. He furrowed his brow as he described the course of events to Phoebe. However, Hanshaw didn't mention any sensitive matters. He didn't go into detail, including Hanshaw's identity in the shadows and the Calamity Church's interference. "When you were transporting this batch of equipment, did you know what was inside?" Hanshaw looked at Phoebe and asked very seriously. Shaking her head, Phoebe's dainty brow furrowed slightly as she responded, "I didn't know. In our line of work, we do sometimes need to take on these kinds of unknown risks. However, I hadn't thought that this matter would involve so much." Since Phoebe didn't know, Hanshaw let out a great sigh of relief in his heart. He mused for a moment and said to Phoebe, The Griffin Legion has the intention of rebelling. For the safety of the Boot Merchant Guild, you must cooperate with us. Otherwise, once the senior executives of the Empire find out that this operation has the help of the Boot Merchant Guild, I'm afraid that no matter how resourceful your merchant guild is, it will still encounter immeasurable danger. Nodding in understanding, Phoebe hugged Hanshaw and said with a smile, I'll do what you say. I think you'll help me seriously. Phoebe said this because she completely trusted Hanshaw, which made Hanshaw feel a little flattered. Thinking quickly, Hanshaw condensed another drop of lifeblood essence and stored it in a small medicine bottle. He handed it to Phoebe and said, think of a way to drip this drop of blood on the siege equipment during transportation. If you don't have a way to open the equipment, drip it on the device that stores the equipment is fine as well. Think of a way to follow this batch of equipment as far as you can tomorrow. Don't be in a hurry to leave Valin City after you're done. I'll come find you again. Oh right, Candace is also in Valin City right now. She's staying at a hotel called Elaine. You can go find her. No problem, I'll try to do it according to your instructions. Phoebe readily agreed and then laughed softly. She took out a large pile of various materials from her space ring and looked at Hanshaw as if presenting a treasure. This batch of materials was requested on one of your lists. I've already gathered all of them for you while helping Bob Asher transport these items. A list was handed over and Hanshaw took a look. He discovered that these materials had all been prepared by Phoebe according to Hanshaw's requests in order to refine the yin demons that were a level higher than the original demons. It looked like Phoebe was very attentive to his matters. In such a short period of time, she had actually gathered enough materials to refine the yin demons for him. Pulling Phoebe over and kissing Phoebe's rosy cheeks, Hanshaw said happily to Phoebe, Heh, thank you so much. The guard's voice sounded again at this time, Miss Phoebe, the sky is already bright. You should get up and leave. Yes, I'm fully awake and will be out soon. Phoebe responded loudly and pushed Hanshaw away. She shyly put on her clothes under the thin blankets and rebuked, It's all your fault. You tore my undergarments, you savage scoundrel. Chuckling mischievously, Hanshaw left Phoebe's bedside and said, All right, I'll make it up to you. Remember what I said, I'll be leaving for now. But you'll find you soon enough. Hanshaw's body slowly retreated outside after he finished speaking. Just as Hanshaw reached the window behind him, Phoebe suddenly called out softly. When Hanshaw turned around and looked at her in surprise, Phoebe warned softly, Be careful. I will. Hanshaw responded confidently and took advantage of the guard's blink to shoot out of the window like a ghost. Hanshaw concealed himself and flew towards the Dark Mantle stronghold early in the morning. When he returned to the Dark Mantle stronghold, Hanshaw discovered that Chester was already there. It looked like he'd returned from Elaine's hotel. What's the situation? Hanshaw immediately asked when he saw Chester. I fainted in the hotel. When I woke up, a great druid said that we'd been drugged and didn't say anything else. Chester was a bit confused as he explained to Hanshaw. He briefly explained what had happened after Chester had fainted and then asked Chester again, Did that great druid chat with the female captain of the mercenary band? Has Lisa been safely sent back? What's the current situation in the hotel? It seems that the great druid and the female mage swordsman called Candace talked about something, but they avoided us, so I don't know what they talked about. I personally handed Lisa over to Lawrence, and he said he'll contact you soon. Master Elaine has arranged for Belinda's room to be redecorated, and it should be back to normal soon. The great druids inside, as well as the mercenary band, are still there and haven't left. Chester responded. So that's how it is. Oh right, did you see Emily after you returned? No, I only saw 2 of Madame Emily's people in charge of guarding the Dark Mantle stronghold. Madame Emily isn't here at the moment. Chester responded. Oh, I see. There's nothing else for me to do for now. If you're free, why don't you go out and scout out the current situation in the city? Hanshaw smiled and walked past Chester towards the secret room. After setting up the transportation matrix here, Hanshaw once again entered the cemetery of death. The little lewd dragon Gilbert immediately ran over excitedly when he saw Hanshaw appear, thinking that Han Shaw was going to take him out. "Now's not the time, but I'll take you out of the cemetery of death in the next few days. Don't worry." When he saw Gilbert rush over with a face full of excitement, Han Shaw immediately poured cold water on him. Afterwards, ignoring Gilbert's protests, Han Shaw arrived at the original demon cave where he'd refined the original demons last time. The refinement of the yin demons was more or less the same as that of the original demons. Apart from making some changes to the matrix, replacing it with even more precious materials, and adding 3 drops of blood essence, there weren't any special changes in other aspects. Taking a deep breath, Han Shaw quickly went through some of the details he needed to pay attention to in his mind. He then took out the Demon Slayer Edge and used his mind to control the Demon Slayer Edge. He began to change the layout of the original demon cave, transforming it into the shape of the Yin Demon Cave. Finally, after the Yin Demon Cave had taken shape, Han Shaw placed the materials that he'd entrusted Phoebe to gather into the Yin Demon Cave according to the sequence of the matrix. When refining the original demons, only 18 wraiths were needed as a catalyst. However, the number of Yin demons had doubled, rising to 36 wraiths. However, the refining time had been shortened to 18 days. This was because Han Shaw's demonic arts had reached the true demon realm, and he had the existence of blood essence, in addition to the leap in quality of his magical yuan. He had to make the 36 wraiths fight each other within a short 18 days, and finally snatch 3 drops of Han Shaw's blood essence. Only the strongest wraiths would have the right to absorb the energy within the Yin Demon Cave and be refined into Yin demons that were even more powerful than the original demons. After the 3 Yin demons were formed, not only would they possess all the effects of the original demons, but their own life force would also be strengthened. They would be able to infiltrate a person's body and remain hidden until the critical moment to deliver a fatal blow. For example, if a person was possessed by a Yin demon, then everything that the person saw and felt would be roughly sensed by Han Shaw through the Yin demons. The Yin demon hidden within the person's body could suddenly act up when the person was in danger, asleep, or in a fight with someone, catching them off guard and attacking the person's body. It would be best if the enemy could be killed. Otherwise, as long as the opponent wasn't particularly strong, the Yin demon could even continue to hide within the person's body, or leave the person's body and escape back to its host, Han Shaw's body. After the other 3 Yin demons were formed, they could also temporarily change into Han Shaw's appearance under the will of the original body, forming an illusion that was identical to Han Shaw. If Han Shaw were to fight at this time, this technique of suddenly forming 3 illusions would often have the effect of confusing and catching the opponent off guard. It could even turn the tide of the battle. When Han Shaw dripped his blood essence and discovered that the 36 wraiths were madly fighting within the Yin Demon Cave, fighting for the 3 drops of Han Shaw's blood essence, Han Shaw discovered that the Yin Demon Cave had already been successfully activated. He didn't continue to stay here and left, ignoring Gilbert's complaints. Chapter 173. After returning from the Cemetery of Death, Han Shaw immediately discovered Emily standing beside the transportation matrix as soon as he appeared in the secret room. "Have you seen your little lover?" Emily immediately asked when she saw Han Shaw. "Phoebe doesn't know anything about the siege equipment that Bob Asher requested. I've also told her that she will cooperate fully with us. I think we can cover up the matter that implicated Phoebe this time." Han Shaw put away the 6 magic wands one by one as he walked out of the transportation matrix and explained to Emily. "If Phoebe really doesn't know anything, then this matter won't implicate her. Our dark mantle will never wrongly accuse an innocent person. You'll know this in the future." Emily said seriously, then giggled and said, "You ran into her room in the middle of the night. Did she think you were a thief who stole a perfume and beat you up?" "Of course not," Han Shaw responded with a natural expression. Emily looked at Han Shaw a few times, trying to glean something from his expression, but discovered that Han Shaw's expression was calm and didn't change at all. All right, that's it for now. I've just received news that Belinda, who you let go, is contacting you through your method. I don't know what she wants." Emily discovered that she couldn't glean anything from Han Shaw's expression, so she didn't say anything else and went straight to business. Han Shoror had left behind a method for Belinda to contact him before she left. Han Shoror had also told this method to Emily so that Emily could keep an eye out for him. Now that he heard her say this, he immediately said, "All right, then let's go see Belinda and see what she wants from me." Han Shoror and Emily walked side by side in the desolate forest where Han Shoror had killed 2 members of the Griffin Legion. Although he'd already left a backup plan on Belinda's body, Han Shoror was still quite cautious. He was extremely focused when he walked over, deathly afraid that he'd fall into Belinda's trap. When Han Shoror entered the forest, he suddenly sensed an enormous presence hidden within. This energy obviously didn't come from Belinda. Han Shoror immediately focused his consciousness and said softly to Emily, "Be careful, there's something unusual in there." Nodding, Emily said, "Yes, it looks like Belinda isn't the only one inside. We should be careful in case Belinda ambushes us. Don't worry, if Belinda really dares to act against us, I'll make sure she's in for it." Han Shoror's expression was calm as he took out the Demon Slayer edge from his space ring and walked into the depths of the forest. Suddenly, a dazzling bolt of lightning shot out from the depths of the dense forest like a dragon swimming in the void. This bolt of lightning was as thick as an arm as it snaked through the air and exploded with dazzling light. The trees on the side creaked as it made its way over, giving rise to thick smoke. Frowning, the Demon Slayer edge shot out according to Han Shoror's will, leaping over several trees in its way and stabbing towards the incoming bolt of lightning. A series of crackling sounds rang out as Han Shoror's Demon Slayer edge sensed the surging fighting aura. This kind of fighting aura was mixed with the power of thunder and lightning, appearing extremely violent and ferocious. Even though Han Shoror had infused the Demon Slayer edge with magical yuan, it still couldn't withstand it for long. Han Shoror felt that something was amiss in that moment of contact and hurriedly directed the Demon Slayer edge to fly back into his palm. "Who's there?" Emily was also very cautious at this moment. She held her magic staff and stared at the bolt of lightning in the air as she shouted in her delicate voice. "Thunder Magus Swordsman Johnny of the Calamity Church, I just want to see if you have the right to cooperate with us." A low voice suddenly sounded from the depths of the forest. A middle-aged man in black armor with silver curly hair walked out from the depths of the forest with Belinda after the voice sounded. This middle-aged man had an ugly, slanted scar from his left eye to his nose, making his already ugly face look even more ferocious. The moment he appeared from the dense forest, his voice had just sounded when his body swiftly flew to the area where the lightning was swimming in the empty space. He extended his hairy right hand and a milky white dough chi instantly flashed. The lightning that was swimming in the empty space seemed to be pulled by a great force and landed in his palm. When the power of thunder and lightning receded, Han Shoror discovered that it was a slender silver longsword. However, the power of thunder and lightning still lingered on the hilt, flashing from time to time. The milky white fighting aura meant that this person had the strength of a swordmaster or earth knight. With this kind of strength and lightning magic, it was no wonder that this person was so strong. Even Han Shoror's Demon Slayer edge couldn't gain the upper hand against him. The veiled Belinda slowly walked out from behind the Thunder Magus Swordsman Johnny. She first apologized when she arrived in front of Han Shoror and then said to Johnny, "Uncle Johnny, I've already told you that their strength is enough to cooperate with us. Otherwise, how would I have failed?" Although this person from the Calamity Church called Johnny seemed to be an arrogant person, he still seemed to respect Belinda. He couldn't help but nod when he heard her say this. Their strength is passable, but what help can they provide us if we cooperate with them? Bob Asher of the Griffin Legion is a Sky Knight. With his strength, these two won't be able to deal with him at all. Only by using your golem to block the others and I'll have the chance to kill him. Emily couldn't help but say when she saw that this person was so arrogant. Apart from Bob Asher being a Sky Knight in the Griffin Legion, there are 5 Earth Knights who follow him all year round. Add to that Clark's Master, Great Swordmaster Gabriel, and 2 Archmages of the earth and water elements. Just based on this strength alone, it'll be a fool's dream if anyone wants to kill him alone unless a Sacred Swordmaster, Sacred Magus, or a Sacred Knight personally makes a move. Heh. Although Mr. Johnny is a Thunder Magus swordsman, it won't be easy for you to defeat Bob Asher himself in a real battle, not to mention his followers. Most people would know about Bob Asher's followers, but they couldn't be like the Dark Mantle, knowing so much about every expert by Bob Asher's side. When Emily described Bob Asher's followers in such detail, even the arrogant Thunder Magus swordsman Johnny's expression changed greatly and he appeared a bit shocked. "Then, what help can you give us?" Johnny asked Emily after a moment of silence with a stoic face. "No matter what goals you have against Bob Asher, I only want to tell you not to act rashly. Otherwise, it won't just be you, but even we will be dragged into this mess. If we work together, I can provide you with detailed information on the people around Bob Asher. This will help you find out where he usually goes and even help you send his followers away in a short amount of time, creating a suitable opportunity for you to assassinate him." Emily revealed a confident smile as she slowly described the things that the Dark Mantle could do for Johnny. "Uncle Johnny, this is exactly what we need." Belinda suddenly spoke up at this moment. "I think you're from the Lancelot Empire?" Johnny wasn't an idiot and naturally guessed the identities of Han Shaw and Emily. Nodding, Emily admitted frankly, "That's right, I hope that you'll keep this a secret for us if we work together." You people are the most hypocritical. You'll work with us when you need us, but you'll turn your back on us when things are over and use all your power to attack our church." Johnny mocked with extreme disdain when he heard Emily's words. "Since that's the case, then this matter is settled. We'll find a suitable opportunity to assassinate Bob Asher in the next 2 days and let you know when we've made the arrangements. You can also take the opportunity to find more reinforcements. Otherwise, it's not very realistic to kill Bob Asher." One could tell from Johnny's expression that although he didn't like serving the country, he seemed to be used to making use of each other. That was why Han Shaw had said this. Judging from the Calamity Church's current display of strength, it wasn't very likely that they would be able to assassinate Bob Asher. Han Shaw and Emily had agreed to work with them not because they hoped to kill Bob Asher, but because they hoped to obtain the information they needed from Bob Asher's manor during the chaos and then use the Dark Mantle's abilities to take him down. "All right, then this matter is settled. I hope that you two don't try any tricks, or you'll regret it." Johnny finally agreed with a darkened face. Chapter 174. After leaving the dense forest, Han Shaw and Emily split up, heading to Lawrence's new residence alone. When Han Shaw arrived and saw Lawrence, he heard Lawrence thank him, "Thank you so much for last time. Otherwise, Lisa might have been in danger." "You're welcome. With my relationship with Lisa, these are things that I should do." "Right, how is Lisa now?" Han Shaw asked Lawrence with a smile after sitting down. "Don't worry, I've already sent someone to send her back to Ossen City. As strong as the Griffin Legion is, they wouldn't dare act wildly in the capital." "That's great. Right, your junior sister Phoebe is also in Valin City right now. She has some dealings with the Griffin Legion." Han Shaw started talking about Phoebe after thinking for a moment. Surprise appeared on his face. Lawrence was quite surprised and asked Han Shaw in confusion, "Why is she in Valin City? What's going on?" Because of his previous understanding, Han Shaw discovered that Lawrence and Phoebe had a good relationship. As the third prince, it would be safer for him to know what Phoebe had done first. Therefore, after Lawrence asked, Han Shaw roughly explained what had happened. When Han Shaw finished speaking, Lawrence furrowed his brow and was silent for a while. He looked deeply at Han Shaw and said, "It looks like the matter of Phoebe this time is all thanks to you. Your Dark Mantle is truly resourceful." Han Shaw started when he heard these words and focused his eyes on Lawrence. After looking deeply at him for a while, Han Shaw exhaled lightly and said to Lawrence, "When did you learn of my identity?" "Since the last time we left the slave trading house." Lawrence responded with a slight smile and hesitated before saying, "To be precise, I only learned of your identity now. After leaving the slave trading house last time, I began to suspect Madame Emily's background. I only understood Madame Emily's identity after I found someone to confirm it in detail, and then began to suspect you. There was nothing dishonorable about working for the Dark Mantle. The existence of the Dark Mantle wasn't a secret amongst the senior executives of the Empire. Their duties and actions wouldn't harm the interests of ordinary people unless they did something harmful to the Empire. Otherwise, the existence of the Dark Mantle would even protect ordinary people. Han Shor didn't feel that there was anything wrong with this. Musing for a moment, Han Shor's expression was the same as usual as he smiled. Not bad, I've just joined the Dark Mantle not long ago, but I do deeply understand how resourceful the Dark Mantle is. Then, you should know me quite well by now? Lawrence suddenly looked at Han Shor with a faint smile on his face. Starting, Han Shor laughed heartily. Of course, you're the son of the finance minister, Lawrence. Everyone knows this. Even though Han Shor was well aware of the third prince's identity, he couldn't say it out loud. Otherwise, his relationship with Lawrence would likely change. At the very least, Lawrence would probe Han Shor's thoughts and perhaps invite Han Shor to work for him. This was a difficult problem that Han Shor wasn't willing to face at the moment, so playing dumb was the wisest course of action. An odd smile appeared on Lawrence's face when he heard Han Shor's words. He looked deeply at Han Shor for a while before responding. All right, let's not talk about this for now. Your Dark Mantle must have come to Valin City this time because you understand that Bob Asher has intentions of rebelling. That's why you've come to gather evidence. My goal in coming here can be said to be the same as yours, to bring down this Griffin Legion commander. Can you tell me how your progress is right now? Han Shor was a bit hesitant when he heard Lawrence's question. He quickly weighed the pros and cons in his mind before saying that he wanted to obtain evidence of the siege equipment and hand it over to the senior executives of the Dark Mantle so that they could officially arrest Bob Asher. However, Han Shor didn't say a word about the matter of allying with the Calamity Church. He didn't want Lawrence to know about this. Since our goals are the same, then I think we can work together. What plans do you have? How can I help you? Lawrence asked Han Shor. Han Shor couldn't help but sweep his eyes over Lawrence when he heard these words. He asked, "Then what can you help us with?" Smiling slightly mysteriously, Lawrence looked deeply at Han Shor and said, "I have someone in the Griffin Legion. This person's position is second only to Bob Asher. This person can directly mobilize the Griffin Legion at certain times and do many things for us." Han Shor's mind spun furiously as he learned a lot of useful information from Lawrence's words. It looked like Lawrence's trip to Valin City this time wasn't as simple as dealing with Bob Asher. It was likely that he'd topple Asher and support his own people to take over the Griffin Legion. This was all in preparation for his future fight for the throne. That would be best. I need to make some plans. There will be a move in the next 2 days. I'll let you know when the time comes and discuss with you how to cooperate. Han Shor thought for a moment and said to Lawrence, "No problem, I'll wait for your good news. Heh, we can be considered friends now. I'm quite confident in your way of doing things. I know that you're cautious enough and that there shouldn't be any major slip-ups after you've carefully thought through your preparations. Let me know when you've settled everything and I'll do my best to cooperate with you. We'll be mutually beneficial." Lawrence laughed heartily and said straightforwardly, "All right then, I'll take my leave now." Han Shor said his goodbyes and left Lawrence's new residence, heading for Elaine's hotel not too far away. When Han Shor arrived at the hotel, he discovered that the damaged room that Belinda had been staying in had been more or less repaired. It looked like it would be ready to be used again in a short period of time. Han Shor and Emily's room hadn't been checked out yet. Therefore, Han Shor returned to the room after arriving at the hotel. The fat middle-aged woman, Elaine, walked in after a short while. She closed the door and said with a smile, "I have to thank you for your help. Otherwise, my hotel would have been destroyed by that Calamity Church woman. It looks like Emily has already told you everything that happened." Han Shor said. Nodding, the owner of the hotel called Elaine said, "Yes, Madam Emily came by once and told me everything that had happened. She also told me to keep an eye on the guests here. What other instructions do you have for me this time? Have the guests in the hotel left yet? Has the female mage swordsman from the mercenary band made contact with anyone else?" Han Shor thought of his agreement with Phoebe and couldn't help but ask. "There haven't been any changes to the guests here. The great druid and that little female elf are still temporarily staying in the hotel. The two went out during the day and returned not long ago. Apart from the woman called Candace, the others from the mercenary band have all gone out for a while. They seem to be searching for new missions and haven't returned yet. I've observed and haven't seen anyone suspicious enter Candace's room, nor have I seen her leave. Apart from that, there's nothing out of the ordinary in the hotel. The Griffin Legion sent someone to inspect once and asked about the collapse of the building, but I brushed it off. Elaine didn't seem to affect her at all when she saw what had happened in the hotel. Her expression was relaxed as she slowly narrated what had happened to Han Shaw in great detail. The Griffin Legion won't be suspicious of this place, will they? Han Shaw asked with furrowed brow after a moment's thought. Don't worry, I think there shouldn't be any problems. I've been in Valen City for many years and I've already made arrangements with the Griffin Legion a long time ago. Elaine assured Han Shaw with great confidence. Han Shaw couldn't say anything else after her words, otherwise it would appear that he didn't trust her. Nodding, Han Shaw said, "You've worked hard." He then motioned for Elaine to go about her own business. After Elaine left, Han Shaw thought for a moment and decided to tell her that Phoebe might be coming to find Candace, in case she suddenly left the hotel. As he walked out of his room, Han Shaw pondered on how to break the news to Candace as he walked towards her room. He suddenly heard Big Bad Guy on the way, and then saw the little elf Angelica pointing excitedly at him from the window of Caspian's room. Smiling wryly and making a fierce face at Angelica, Han Shaw ignored her and continued walking towards Candace's room. However, Han Shaw heard footsteps coming from Angelica's direction. It was obvious that the little elf Angelica had caught up to him. "Big Bad Guy, what are you doing here?" The little elf Angelica had rushed out in the blink of an eye and looked at Han Shaw with a bit of joy. "I've come out to kidnap a little girl like you." Han Shaw blinked and chuckled evilly. Chapter 175. "Phut, you think you can trick me? I don't believe it." Angelica was quite disdainful as she pouted and wrinkled her delicate nose. "It's up to you whether you believe it or not. All right, I still have things to do. Go do what you need to do." Saying this with a smile, Han Shaw didn't pay any attention to Angelica and planned on going to Candace's room. At this moment, the door creaked open from the room that Angelica had run out from. The great druid Caspian walked out and only glanced at Han Shaw before exclaiming in surprise, "How can it be you?" Nodding at Caspian in a friendly manner with a smile, Han Shaw bowed, "Greetings, great druid Elder Caspian. I met you last time in the dark forest with Trunks." "Hey, you know my grandfather as well?" Angelica was quite surprised to see Han Shaw greet Caspian. She looked at her grandfather and then looked at Han Shaw. Han Shaw smiled and was about to respond when Caspian's eyes lit up. He looked over Han Shaw's body and a thoughtful smile suddenly appeared on his face. "So it's you. But we should have met recently, heh." Although Han Shaw had been wearing a black hood not too long ago, his physique and voice hadn't been concealed. In addition, Han Shaw had called out Caspian's name when things had concluded. Based on these three flaws, it wasn't strange that Caspian would quickly recognize Han Shaw when he saw Han Shaw again. Han Shaw didn't argue or explain anything with regards to Caspian's words. He flashed a meaningful smile at Caspian and said, "I have some matters to attend to, goodbye. Little Angelica, don't disturb other people's business. Hurry and come back to the room with me." Caspian nodded knowingly and grabbed the little elf, planning on leaving with Angelica. Candace, who'd heard Han Shaw's words, just happened to open the door at this moment. She looked at Han Shaw and then at Caspian, who was talking to Han Shaw, with surprise. She nodded at the two in a friendly manner and finally said to Han Shaw, "You've come to find me? Sister Candace, I've come to look for you as well. Let me go in as well." Angelica called out sweetly to Candace, "If our cute little elf really has something to do, then I'll come find you later. But I have some matters to attend to right now." Candace laughed lightly and opened the door. She leaned to the side and said to Han Shaw, "Come in." "All right, stop messing around. Come back to my room and continue practicing magic. The druid Caspian glared at Angelica reproachfully and pulled her back. Candace closed the door tightly after Han Shaw entered Candace's room. She then seemed to think of something and suddenly looked at Han Shaw. You were the one who saved us last night? Han Shaw didn't need to deny anything about this and nodded. This matter is a bit complicated. Has Belinda, who hired you, paid your commission? Shaking her head with a wry smile, Candace said, she's from the Calamity Church. This church has always done things in an evil and sinister manner. I'm already very lucky that nothing happened to me. How could I have received a commission? Promise me one thing. Don't try to make trouble for Belinda. You won't get anything out of this. As for the commission she paid you this time, I'll help you get it back. Han Shaw thought for a moment and stared at Candace. Candace was a bit taken aback when she heard these words and looked at Han Shaw in confusion. I heard from Caspian that you and a woman took Belinda away. Just who are you? Since you've captured Belinda, why would you say that? This matter is a bit complicated. I'll explain it to you when Phoebe gets here. But don't think about doing anything to Belinda, because I know the strength she holds. She's not someone that your Battlefire mercenary band can handle. Although Han Shaw hadn't known Candace for long, he knew that she wasn't the type to give up easily. He also understood that even if she knew that her life was in danger, she would still do it if she set her mind on something. This was why he was trying to persuade her. Hey, why is Phoebe here as well? Candace first cried out in surprise and then said to Han Shaw with a resolute expression, you're a bit too late. I've already arranged for the others to search for Belinda's tracks. The Mercenary Association should bear our losses now that something has happened to our employer. I'll deal with Belinda myself. I'm begging you, sister. Let Belinda go for now. This woman is in my hands right now and I need her to do some things. Can you give me some face? For a woman as unreasonable as Candace, the more he told her that there was great danger, the more stubborn she would become. With no other choice, Han Shaw could only use this method to convince her. Candace was no longer so insistent after hearing Han Shaw's words. Her bright, resolute eyes stared at Han Shaw for a while before she nodded reluctantly. Since you're begging me so, then all right, I promise you that I won't pursue this matter any further. However, Belinda must give us the commission she's due, otherwise I won't be able to answer to the captain. No problem at all. I'll have Belinda pay up in the next 2 days after I've interrogated her. Han Shaw hastened to agree when he saw that Candace had loosened up. As Han Shaw and Candace spoke, the sound of their footsteps approached from the outside. Han Shaw then heard the owner of the hotel, Elaine's voice. This room is where Miss Candace lives. Thank you very much. Phoebe's cold, proud voice sounded from outside at this moment. A look of pleasant surprise appeared on Candace's face as she shot to her feet, quickly walking to open the door. When the door opened, Phoebe, dressed in an elegant dress, had a noble, aloof expression on her face. However, the coldness on her face faded as soon as she saw Candace. A radiant smile appeared on her face as she cried out in surprise, Candace, you're really here. Not only me, there's also someone inside that you must want to see. Candace laughed heartily and moved to the side to let Phoebe walk in. At the door, Elaine took advantage of this short moment to change her position and poke her head in for a peek. She was quite surprised when she saw that Han Shaw was inside, but Phoebe had already walked in at this moment and the door was closed by Candace. After last night's romantic entanglement, Phoebe's beautiful face immediately flushed red when she saw Han Shaw again. Perhaps it was because Candace was right next to her, but Phoebe's body was a bit shy and unnatural. She didn't even dare look at Han Shaw too much, and only snuck a glance at Han Shaw after she'd arrived. She then minded her own business and caught up with Candace, her large, bright eyes watching Han Shaw out of the corner of her eye. Han Shaw felt a bit awkward when he saw Phoebe this time because there was an outsider present. However, his skin was thick to begin with and he wasn't too affected. He still sat there drinking tea with a straight face, his expression rather natural. The two women chatted for a while, briefly recounting their experiences after they'd left last time. They both focused their conversation on what had happened in Valin City. Because the two had both met Hanshaw naturally became the main topic of discussion. "Tell me, why did you come to Valin City this time, and why do you know where I live? Also, Candace said that you were with a woman, what's all this about?" After Phoebe and Candace had discussed for a while, Phoebe finally looked at Hanshaw and asked Hanshaw. Candace was also quite astonished and added, "Belinda is a member of the Calamity Church and shouldn't have any relationship with you. Why would you capture her and use her to do something? Just who are you?" The two women had a bellyful of questions and looked at Hanshaw, trying to get Hanshaw to give a reasonable explanation. Although Hanshaw already had a plan in mind, it was still a bit of a headache when he really had to explain. However, this matter wasn't something that could be easily brushed aside because some matters were a bit complicated. Hanshaw's brow furrowed at this moment. He coughed lightly when he heard that someone was coming in and made a gesture for the two to be silent. The sound of footsteps grew closer and the door was knocked lightly. Emily's gentle voice traveled in from outside, "I know you're all inside. May I come in?" Phoebe and Candace looked at Hanshaw suspiciously and asked at the same time, "Who is she?" "She's the woman you've been asking about." Hanshaw smiled wryly. He hadn't thought that Emily would want to butt in at this time. If it had been yesterday, when Hanshaw hadn't been intimate with Phoebe, Hanshaw wouldn't have been afraid of the two of them meeting. But now, Hanshaw's head was swelling as he racked his brain over how to handle the relationship between the two. Chapter 176. Why have you come? Unsure of Emily's intentions, although Hanshaw's expression was normal, his heart was a mess. He smiled apologetically at Emily. "I've only come to discuss with you how we should deal with the chief of the Griffin Legion." It was unknown whether or not Emily was doing this on purpose, but she didn't even glance at Hanshaw after entering. She only looked at Phoebe and Candace as they spoke. "Hey, aren't you Madam Emily? Why do you know Brian? What's going on?" Phoebe's interest in the relationship between Emily and Hanshaw was obviously far greater than dealing with the Griffin Legion. She couldn't help but ask when she saw that the person who'd come was Emily. Phoebe sneaked a glance at Hanshaw after speaking and walked towards Hanshaw with a flushed face. She even reached out her slender, jade hands to hold onto Hanshaw's arm, raising her head in a show of force at Emily. If it had been yesterday, Hanshaw could have disregarded Phoebe's face and explained that the relationship between the two was just an act. But after last night's romantic entanglement, there was no way he could explain anything now. He could only smile awkwardly at Emily without saying a word. A complicated luster flickered in Emily's eyes as she looked deeply at Hanshaw. Hanshaw felt a strong sense of guilt in his heart after staring at her for a while. His expression hardened as he took a deep breath and said to Phoebe, "Actually, my relationship with Emily is, we're both superiors and subordinates of the Dark Mantle. We've only taken on the same mission at the same time this time. Miss Phoebe need not take it to heart." Just as Hanshaw was about to explain, Emily had been closely watching Hanshaw's expression and suddenly interrupted Hanshaw's following words, glossing over what Hanshaw had been about to say. Hanshaw was flabbergasted. He didn't understand why Emily would say this. When he looked at Emily with surprise, he found that Emily was giving him a gratified smile. It was as if Emily only needed Hanshaw's true approval from the bottom of his heart. It was as if Hanshaw's decision was what she wanted. It wasn't to compete with Phoebe for undeserved fame and the pleasure of a moment. Phoebe felt a bit awkward after hearing Emily's words. It was as if she was being petty. It was a good thing that Phoebe was also a strong woman in charge of a large firm. After only a moment of awkwardness, Phoebe immediately put down Hanshaw and walked leisurely to Emily's side. She bowed slightly and said apologetically, "I'm sorry, Sister Emily, I was overthinking things. With your identity and status, you naturally wouldn't take a liking to a scoundrel like him." Emily deeply agreed with Phoebe's way of cursing Hanshaw as a scoundrel. However, Emily sighed slightly in her heart and thought to herself, "I just had to board this scoundrel's pirate ship and now I can't extricate myself. It's impossible for me to like a rude and disrespectful fellow like him. Besides, I'm already married, so it's even more impossible. Don't let your imagination run wild. Emily sighed lightly in her heart, but still wore a smile on her face as she comforted Phoebe. I'd long since noticed that this fellow was always secretive. So he's from the Empire's dark mantle. We should have guessed long ago. Candace looked at Hanshaw with interest and said with a light smile. Contrary to Hanshaw's expectations, both Phoebe and Candace didn't seem surprised at all after his identity had been exposed by Emily. It was as if Hanshaw's actions had long since been taken for granted by them that he was from a secret organization. Emily's revelation seemed to only help them confirm the suspicions in their hearts. That's what I said, he's always been secretive. As a student of the necromancy major, he often does strange things. So he has another identity as a member of the Dark Mantle. This completely explains his strange actions in the past. Phoebe chuckled lightly and rolled her eyes at Hanshaw from afar on Emily's side, as if blaming Hanshaw for keeping secrets from her. Shrugging, Hanshaw said, "All right, I think now isn't the time to talk about these things. How to help Phoebe extricate herself from this matter and take down Griffin Legion Chief Bob Asher should be our top priority right now." The two girls finally stopped discussing Hanshaw's identity after hearing Hanshaw's words. Because Emily didn't know how much Hanshaw had told the two girls, it was still Hanshaw who explained things to the two girls this time. "My senior brother Lawrence is also in Valin City." Phoebe was a bit surprised when Hanshaw mentioned Lawrence's existence and exclaimed softly. Nodding, Hanshaw said, "That's right, Lawrence will also help us in this matter. He originally came to Valin City because of his cousin Lisa's family. What happened to Lisa's family was completely caused by the chief of the Griffin Legion. Lawrence wants to take revenge for Lisa's family, so he will do his best to help us." Hanshaw had understood Lawrence's purpose in coming after their last conversation. It wasn't just to save Lisa, but to eliminate the chief of the Griffin Legion and support his own people in the position of chief. However, Hanshaw couldn't say much to the two girls due to Lawrence's identity, so he could only say that he was only willing to help because of Lisa. "I've already done as you requested and secretly dripped a drop of blood onto one of the siege weapons. We were escorted all the way to a place in the west of the city before being taken away by the soldiers of the Griffin Legion. I think that the Griffin Legion's weapons storehouse must be there. We can look there." Phoebe narrated her actions after leaving Hanshaw after Hanshaw had finished speaking. "Very good, the Griffin Legion's weapons storehouse is indeed there. I'll be able to ascertain the direction after making a trip there. As long as we obtain the records of the Griffin Legion's purchase of this batch of siege weapons and report it to our superiors, we'll be able to catch Bob Asher red-handed for the crime of treason." Hanshaw was overjoyed when he heard Phoebe's words. Hanshaw and the three girls discussed for a while after he'd spoken. They used a mission as an excuse to leave with Emily. Candace frowned when Hanshaw and Emily had just walked out of the room. "I keep feeling that his relationship with Madame Emily isn't quite right. The tone of their conversation seems a bit too intimate." "Heh, don't overthink things. Madame Emily is a widow and a member of the Betteridge family. Nothing will happen to her." Phoebe had a blissful smile on her face as she comforted Candace. "Oh right, you two haven't really put on an act, have you? Otherwise, you wouldn't have such an expression." Candace suddenly exclaimed softly in surprise when she saw Phoebe's expression of a little girl immersed in love and happiness. Phoebe's face became even redder when she heard Candace's question. She said bashfully, Last night we already, my gosh, Phoebe, you're too open. You slept with him so quickly." Candace's red lips parted and she couldn't help but cry out before Phoebe had finished speaking. "Pa, what nonsense are you spouting? We only confirmed our relationship last night." Phoebe's face was flushed red with embarrassment as she cursed Candace lowly and hurriedly defended herself. "I think it's not just confirmed our relationship, there's something else you're hiding from your expression. Hurry up and tell me the truth." Candace watched Phoebe attentively and immediately closed in on Phoebe with a face full of gossip after she'd finished speaking, viciously demanding that Phoebe explain everything. Hanshaw and Emily didn't immediately go on their mission after leaving Candace's room, but instead walked towards Emily's room together with tacit understanding. After the two entered the room and closed the door, Hanshaw casually pulled Emily into his arms and asked softly, "Why?" "I only need to know that you have me in your heart. That's enough. I'm much older than you, and I also have the status of the Betteridge family's daughter-in-law. If you try to expose our relationship, it will have a great impact on both you and me." Emily snuggled into Hanshaw's arms and sighed softly, speaking of her difficulties. Before Hanshaw's strength was strong enough, it would indeed have a great impact if their relationship was exposed, especially to Emily. This was especially true for Emily. Not only would it affect her brother's career, it would also be an ugly blow to the Betteridge family. Therefore, Emily could only lament and feel sorry for herself, but there was nothing she could do. Phoebe is a good girl. Although her birth isn't noble, at least she's clean and has no fetters. You should be with her. Her business will also help your career in the future. I can completely understand you. Emily buried her head in Hanshaw's chest and murmured softly, "I promise you, our sneaky days will only be temporary. There will be a day when no one in the entire empire will dare to interfere in my affairs. I will give you what you deserve," Hanshaw promised with a resolute expression. He kissed Emily's body fiercely and carried her to the bedroom. Emily responded to Hanshaw with an unprecedented passion, perhaps wanting to make up for the hidden bitterness she felt this time through intense pleasure. Chapter 177. Hanshaw left on his own after a bout of lovemaking with Emily, heading for the Griffin Legion's weapons warehouse in the west of the city. Through the eyes and ears of the Dark Mantle, Hanshaw had a rough idea of the location of the weapons warehouse. There was no trace of Hanshaw when he moved in the night. After using the art of the demonic ninth heavens to sneak into the weapons warehouse, Hanshaw hid himself in a remote corner and calmly activated his magical yuan, using the demon infant to sense the location of the drop of blood essence. Hanshaw felt the demon infant pulse as he did so, and with a single thought, he sensed the exact location of the drop of blood essence. After avoiding the patrolling Griffin Legion soldiers, Hanshaw stopped not far from a low building. Using his bright eyes, Hanshaw discovered that the building was heavily guarded. Apart from the heavily guarded front door, the windowless room was completely sealed off. After observing for a while, Hanshaw calmed his mind and sensed for a bit. He could clearly feel that the drop of blood essence was actually under the house. This meant that there must be a secret chamber in the basement of the house that was specifically used to store items. It was a pity that the Earth Elite zombie hadn't been born yet. Otherwise, the Earth Elite zombie would be able to burrow into the ground and explore with the power of the Earth element. Without the Earth Elite zombie, Hanshaw would have to take care of all the guards at the door if he wanted to go in and see what was going on. Although the guards weren't weak, Hanshaw was still confident that he could take care of them without anyone noticing. However, doing so would definitely alert the enemy, and perhaps the siege equipment would be moved away again. Therefore, after thinking for a while, Hanshaw didn't act rashly and instead retreated back the way he'd come. Within the Dark Mantle stronghold, Hanshaw and Emily met up. They took into account the various factions in Valen City, including Lawrence of the Calamity Church, and carefully assessed Bob Asher's strength. The two furrowed their brows as they began to think of a strategy to deal with Bob Asher. Hanshaw learned from the Dark Mantle that there was a secret room hidden within Bob Asher's mansion. The two of them discussed for a while and were certain that the records of Bob Asher's purchase of siege equipment would be hidden in that secret room. There might also be some other incriminating evidence. After some discussion, they finally decided to sneak into Bob Asher's mansion when he held Clark's funeral the next night. They would make use of the important person in Lawrence's grasp to make the defenses even more lax. They would move away a portion of the people around Bob Asher and use the Calamity Church to assassinate Bob Asher. Hanshaw and Emily would take the opportunity to go to the secret room and see if they could find any useful information. After the general action agenda was decided, Hanshaw and Emily carefully considered some of the problems that they might encounter and came up with countermeasures over and over again. When the two of them felt that it was about time, Hanshaw finally made his move. He went to see Belinda and Lawrence of the Calamity Church and carefully discussed the plan with both sides. Although this matter had something to do with Phoebe, there was no need for Phoebe to help Hanshaw at all. However, when Emily learned from Hanshaw that Phoebe was a swordmaster, she included Phoebe in her plans based on the principle of not letting things go to waste. The reason was that Phoebe had already been implicated, and this would be a good way to explain things to her in the future. While Hanshaw was discussing things with Belinda and Lawrence, Emily had also made an appearance to find Phoebe and Candace. No one knew how she persuaded them, but both Phoebe and Candace readily agreed to Emily's invitation and joined the operation this time. When Hanshaw returned to Elaine's hotel from Lawrence's place and was about to find Phoebe, he ran into the great druid Caspian along the way. Hanshaw didn't think much of it and nodded to Caspian, intending to pass him and leave. "Wait a moment." Caspian suddenly called out at this moment. Hanshaw was startled and turned to look at Caspian in confusion. He smiled. "Elder, is there something you need from me?" Nodding with a smile, Caspian said in the hallway, "If you don't mind, can you come with me to my room? I have a favor to ask of you." It was all thanks to Caspian's help last time at Elaine's hotel. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been so easy for Hanshaw to rescue Emily from Belinda's group of 4, much less capture Belinda alive. Hanshaw nodded straightforwardly and said with a smile, "No problem." Hanshaw followed Caspian to the room he was staying in after speaking. There wasn't anything special about this room, but when Hanshaw walked in, he could feel that some of the decorations in the room blossomed with vigorous vitality. "Hey, big scoundrel, why are you here?" The little elf, Angelica, seemed to be meditating on a bed in the room. She opened her bright eyes when she heard the door open and couldn't help but cry out when she saw Hanshaw. "Don't be so rude, Angelica. You need to know how to respect others, or others won't respect you." The druid Caspian glared sternly at Angelica and lectured. "Got it, Grandpa." Angelica stuck out her tongue and made a face at Caspian's scolding, speaking a bit timidly. When they arrived, Hanshaw sat down on a chair in the living room at Caspian's instructions. Angelica didn't continue meditating at this time. She hopped down from the bed and walked into the living room, her bright eyes looking at Hanshaw with great interest. "Elder, do you have any instructions?" Hanshaw sat down and looked at Caspian with a slight smile. "You're too courteous, it's not instructions. I just want to ask you for a favor, but I don't know if it'll be too much trouble for you." Caspian had a benevolent smile on his face as he looked at Hanshaw. Tomorrow night, Hanshaw planned on moving out with Emily and the others. If Caspian wanted to affect Hanshaw's movements, then Hanshaw wouldn't be able to agree. Therefore, Hanshaw said honestly, "Please tell me first. If I can help you, I definitely won't refuse. However, I also have matters to attend to this time and hope that the elder will forgive me if I can't leave." Caspian nodded understandingly when he heard Hanshaw's words. He then mused for a moment and pointed at Angelica. "I'm going out today and will be back by tomorrow at the latest. However, I can't bring Angelica with me. I hope that you can help me take care of Angelica between today and tomorrow and ensure that her safety won't be threatened." Hanshaw wouldn't be moving out until tomorrow night. Hanshaw had already arranged many things. Hanshaw really didn't have anything particularly important to do between today and tomorrow. Even if there were some urgent matters, there were still Emily, Phoebe, and the others who could use them. Therefore, Hanshaw only thought for a moment after Caspian's words and readily agreed. He smiled. "No problem, I really don't have anything important to do at this time. Valin City has been very chaotic recently, so you must be careful if you head out." With Caspian's strength, he must be doing something very dangerous if he insisted on leaving the hotel at this time and couldn't bring Angelica with him. He must be afraid of endangering Angelica's life, which was why he didn't bring her with him. This was why Hanshaw had kindly reminded him. "Grandpa, you must be going to find that enemy for a duel. Take me with you. I've practiced magic for so long, I can help you deal with him." Angelica obviously knew a bit about Caspian. Her little face immediately changed when she heard these words and she reached out to grab Caspian's arm, begging anxiously. "No, you can't go. A duel is a matter between two people. If I take you with me, it'll be against the rules." Caspian loved Angelica dearly, But he obviously wouldn't budge on this matter. He firmly refused her suggestion. In actuality, Han Shaw understood from Caspian's words and tone that Caspian didn't want to take Angelica with him. That was because he didn't want Angelica to take the risk with him. Saying that it was against the rules was just an excuse for Angelica. But the enemy might not follow the rules. Angelica cried out anxiously and then looked at Han Shaw. She suddenly said, "Although this person is bad, his strength isn't bad. Why don't you let him help you? I'll protect myself. No matter what the other does, Grandpa will never break the rules." Are you not even going to listen to Grandpa's words? Caspian's brow furrowed as he glared at Angelica. Angelica and Caspian looked at each other stubbornly for a while and finally gave in. She said with an abnormally worried and tearful face, "Then, you must be careful." "I will." Caspian answered Angelica and then said to Han Shaw, "Then I'll be troubling you." Caspian nodded gratefully at Han Shaw after saying these words and walked towards the door, pushing it open and leaving. Chapter 178. Big Bad Guy, Will My Grandpa Be Alright? As soon as the great druid Caspian left, the little elf Angelica looked at Han Shaw with a heavy expression of worry. Caspian obviously didn't have any helpers in Valin City, otherwise he wouldn't have entrusted Angelica to a stranger like him. If his enemies were in Valin City and didn't fight him according to the rules, then he would be in great danger. However, in order to reassure Angelica, Han Shaw could only smile and say, "Don't worry, your grandpa is so strong, he won't be in any danger." Angelica, who had seemed carefree before, suddenly became worried because of her grandfather's matter. Her brows were tightly furrowed, and she suddenly became much quieter. Tomorrow night, Han Shaw would join forces with the other powers to deal with the Griffin Legion. Today was an abnormally important day for Belinda and Lawrence of the Calamity Church. They needed to make use of the resources in their hands and make preparations ahead of time. After staying here for a while, Han Shaw felt that waiting in Angelica's room wasn't a good idea. He thought for a moment and said to the sullen little elf, "Come, let's go play with your sister Candace." "I'm not going anywhere, I'm waiting for my grandpa here." Contrary to Han Shaw's expectations, the playful Angelica didn't pay attention to Han Shaw and instead firmly refused Han Shaw's suggestion. Han Shaw started and said, "You can't stay here either. I think your grandpa will be fine. You can talk to Sister Candace and perhaps she won't be so worried. I know you want to go see Sister Candace yourself, you big bad guy. You can go if you want, I'm not going." Angelica glared angrily at Han Shaw and snorted, ignoring Han Shaw. Han Shaw didn't know whether to laugh or cry at her words. However, Han Shaw had already promised Caspian. It was true that Valin City hadn't been peaceful during this time, and he really didn't feel comfortable leaving her here alone. He didn't want Caspian's enemies to seize the opportunity to threaten him. Seeing Angelica's stubborn expression, Han Shaw muttered to himself for a moment before fiercely saying, "I don't care if you're willing or not. In any case, I promised your grandfather that you wouldn't leave my side." Before Angelica could react to these words, Han Shaw's body dashed forward like a bolt of lightning. He suddenly stood by Angelica's side and extended his left arm, grabbing Angelica's body. His left hand exerted force, and Angelica was lifted into the air by Han Shaw's iron claw-like arm. "Let go, you big bastard, big pervert, let go of me." By the time Angelica came to her senses, she discovered that she could no longer move her body. Her two little feet kept kicking about as she angrily cursed and complained. Han Shaw paid no attention to Angelica's cries at all. He opened the door to the room with her body in his grasp and walked directly to Candace's room. Han Shaw discovered that Angelica was still yelling as soon as he walked out of the room. In order to prevent her from attracting too much attention, Han Shaw extended his right hand and covered Angelica's little mouth. Angelica's loud cries then turned into low whimpers, as if she was being held hostage by Han Shaw. "Put her down." Just as Han Shaw was about to reach Candace's room, a few people from the Battlefire mercenary band suddenly walked out from the two sides of Candace's room. They looked at Han Shaw with unkind expressions, and one of them, a burly swordsman with short, steel needle-like hair and a sword on his back, shouted coldly at Hanshoro. "Hey! Isn't he the one who spoke with the vice-chief outside the city?" One of the journeyman mags recognized Hanshoro with a glance and said in surprise. No matter what relationship he has with the vice-chief, his actions of taking a girl hostage in public has angered me. I can't just watch him take that pitiful little elf away. The burly senior swordsman spoke very righteously and glared at Hanshoro with his bell-like eyes. He slowly took out a long sword from his back and pointed it at Hanshoro. Hanshoro was speechless. Candace's room door was also opened at this time, and a confused Candace and Phoebe walked out. The two didn't know what had happened, and their eyes focused on Hanshoro. It was Candace who asked with surprise, "What's wrong, Brian? Why did you grab little Angelica?" "Nothing much. Her grandfather has gone out on business and asked me to protect her. I just want to make sure that she'll always stay by my side." Hanshoro shrugged and responded easily. "Davis, this is just a misunderstanding. Don't be so nervous." Candace laughed lightly and spoke to the burly senior swordsman. "His words are useless. Only that beautiful elf girl's words can prove his innocence." For some reason, Davis was still quite stubborn after hearing Candace's words. His large eyes stared blankly at the little elf Angelica whose mouth had been covered by Hanshoro. Hanshoro immediately released the hand covering Angelica's mouth when he spoke and said to Angelica, "All right, stop messing around. Tell him that I only want to protect you." Angelica's clear curses once again rang out when Hanshoro released his hand. She glared angrily at Hanshoro and said hatefully, "Big bad guy, you're holding me hostage, you're holding me hostage." Davis flew into a rage when Angelica's words left her mouth. He pointed the long sword in his hand at Hanshoro and said righteously, "Release her immediately or you'll regret it." "All right, Davis, can't you see that Angelica is just messing around? If there's nothing else, why don't you go back to your room and recover your strength? Don't meddle in matters that have nothing to do with you." Candace's face grew cold and looked quite imposing. Her bright eyes widened as she glared angrily at Davis. Perhaps Davis was used to Candace's berating, but he seemed to be a bit timid at first. However, when he looked at Angelica, courage came out of nowhere and he stuck out his chest, saying, "Madam Candace, if your suggestion is wrong, I won't listen." Hanshoro was quite amused at this moment. Hanshoro discovered that there was a different kind of heat in Davis' gaze when he looked at Angelica. Hanshoro's heart moved and he already had an idea of what was going on. Chuckling strangely, Hanshoro said, "So that's how it is. It looks like this brave mercenary wants to be a hero in front of the little beauty. Perhaps he has other thoughts in mind." Candace and Phoebe, as well as the mercenaries on the side, all looked at Davis strangely after these words were spoken. Even the little elf Angelica was startled and looked at Davis with a bit of astonishment. At this moment, Davis' face reddened and he awkwardly defended himself. "No, no such thing." Hanshoro loosened his grip on Angelica and put her down. He spread his hands and said, "All right, I won't continue to hold you hostage. There's a hero here who wants to save the damsel in distress, so I'll fulfill his wish. Little Angelica, you've already been saved. Let your hero save you. I won't bother with you anymore." After saying these words, Hanshoro walked towards Candace and Phoebe with a relaxed expression. He didn't even look at Angelica, as if he'd completely forgotten what he'd promised her grandfather. Hello, you're safe now." Davis walked towards Angelica at this moment and spoke with a bit of a disdainful tone in contrast to his previous righteous attitude towards Hanshoro. "What does that have to do with you, big dumb bear? I'm happy to be held hostage by him. What can you do about it?" Angelica suddenly panicked when she saw that Hanshoro wasn't paying attention to her. When she saw Davis walking over with a licking face, her instincts made her angry no matter how she looked at it. She immediately opened her mouth to speak angrily. The expression on Davis' face suddenly became quite peculiar, as if someone had stepped on his face with a dirty shoe. There was an unspeakable bitterness and embarrassment. "Big bad guy, you promised my grandfather that you'd take care of me. You're not allowed to leave." After yelling at Davis, the little elf Angelica lifted her little flower dress and sprinted towards Hanshoro. She shouted loudly as she ran, as if she was afraid that Hanshaw would ignore her. As for Davis, he didn't even spare him a glance. Candace glared at Davis when she saw that he was still standing there with a wry smile on his face. She said unhappily, "Get back to your room and don't embarrass me. If you want to be a hero and save a damsel in distress, you should first see clearly if the beauty is willing to be captured by the devil. You don't know anything and just randomly save her. You deserve to make a fool of yourself." When Candace said these words, the shamefaced Davis let out a long sigh and walked back to his room with his tail between his legs. This kind of matter was indeed a bit complicated for his brain. Even now, he still couldn't understand why Angelica, who'd had a face full of indignation and unwillingness just a moment ago, had turned into a pitiful begging when Hanshaw let go of her and left in a carefree and unrestrained manner. Chapter 179. Angelica finally followed Hanshaw into Candace's room. Hanshaw chatted with Candace and Phoebe for a while, learning that Emily had gone out to take care of business. With Candace and Phoebe here, Hanshaw didn't need to worry about Angelica's safety. He excused himself with business and returned to his room, silently practicing another high-level necromancy magic, hate warrior summoning. With Clarendon's many years of memories and Hanshaw's unyielding spirit, he finally grasped the art of summoning a hate warrior after a few hours of torment. He summoned a hate warrior wielding a metal rod from the other dimension to his front. This hate warrior's summoning consumed quite a bit of Hanshaw's mental strength. He meditated for a while and felt his mental strength rapidly recover. He then used the transportation matrix to return to the cemetery of death. "Evil master, shouldn't you be taking me out of here this time?" Gilbert started yelling loudly when Hanshaw appeared. "That's right, I'm really going to take you out of here this time," Hanshaw said with a smile when he saw Gilbert walk over dejectedly. When he heard that he could leave the cemetery of death, the dejection on Gilbert's face was instantly replaced by excitement, and a string of flattery flowed out. "All right, make your preparations. We'll be leaving in a bit," Hanshaw said impatiently and quickly walked to the place where he was refining the Earth Elite Zombie. He discovered that the Earth Chi was flowing more and more slowly towards the center. It looked like all the Earth Chi in the Cemetery of Death was about to be absorbed by the Earth Elite Zombie that was about to evolve. On the other side of the Yin Demon Cave, the Wraiths were still fighting and devouring each other, fighting over the 3 drops of blood essence that Hanshaw had dropped. Because his strength had already reached the true demon realm, Hanshaw's demonic yuan had already undergone a qualitative change. Coupled with the support of 3 drops of blood essence, he could maintain the Yin Demon Cave for a long time. Hanshaw didn't need to inject demonic yuan every day like when he was refining the original demons. Seeing that everything was normal in the Cemetery of Death, Hanshaw didn't continue to stay here. After giving the little lewd dragon Gilbert a few reminders, he left with him. After returning to Elaine's hotel, Hanshaw let Gilbert stay in the room while he practiced his demonic arts for the whole night, adjusting his state to its peak. On the afternoon of the second day, Hanshaw shut himself in his room and ordered Gilbert not to take a single step out. In a single day, Hanshaw had mastered the advanced necromancy magic, Corpse Explosion. When it was almost evening, Gilbert couldn't bear it any longer and yelled at Hanshaw, "What the hell is this place? I've been staying here ever since I came out of that place. I'm about to get sick from the boredom." Hanshaw, who was meditating, suddenly breathed a sigh of relief and opened his deep eyes. He looked at Gilbert. "All right, we'll leave this place immediately. When we leave, shut up for the rest of the journey and do whatever I want you to do. If you dare act on your own, I'll leave you in the Cemetery of Death forever." What are we doing tonight?" "Haha, honored master, don't worry, I won't be a burden to you." Gilbert immediately responded with great excitement when he heard Hanshaw's words. Footsteps sounded from outside at this moment, and then Emily's voice sounded from outside. "Are you inside?" When he heard that it was Emily, Hanshaw immediately stood up and opened the door. "How is it? Has everything been settled?" Emily's beautiful figure was revealed when the door opened. Gilbert's eyes lit up and he suddenly whistled, saying excitedly, "A beauty, a great beauty." "Shut up." Hanshaw turned his head and glared fiercely at Gilbert. Gilbert didn't dare open his mouth after being scolded by Hanshaw, but his eyes darted shiftily at Emily and then looked at Hanshaw with a face full of envy. "Who is he?" Emily didn't know of Gilbert's existence and couldn't help but ask Hanshaw in surprise when she saw him suddenly appear next to Hanshaw. "He's one of us, there won't be any problems. He'll move with us, and his strength will be of great help to us," Hanshaw explained. Although Gilbert was only a young dark dragon, he possessed great destructive power when he transformed into a dragon. If a dark dragon appeared at a critical juncture, it would greatly increase the safety of Hanshaw and the others. Emily never doubted Hanshaw's words. Gilbert's appearance only gave Emily a deeper understanding of Hanshaw's mysteriousness, and she didn't question Hanshaw's methods. The great druid Caspian hasn't returned yet, and the little elf Angelica is very worried. This time, it's not related to the Battlefire mercenary band, so apart from Candace, no one else knows of our identities or our movements. When we first arrived, Candace temporarily entrusted Angelica to the other members of the Battlefire mercenary band to look after her. That senior swordsman named Davis seemed very happy to do it, so you don't have to worry about Angelica's safety. It looked like Emily must have heard about the small friction between her and Davis from Phoebe and Candace, which was why she'd said this to Hanshaw. "All right, since that's the case, let's leave." Hanshaw thought for a moment and said. The fact that the great druid Caspian still hadn't returned meant that something must have happened. However, Hanshaw didn't have a deep relationship with Caspian and naturally wouldn't delay the important matters that he'd been planning for so long for Caspian. Bob Asher, who wasn't young anymore, had lost 2 sons in a row in the span of a few months. This matter had greatly affected him. As the true master of Valin City, Clark's death still required a funeral according to the rules. All sorts of luxurious carriages were parked in front of Asher's manor. None of the people with status in Valin City dared not give face at this time. No matter how busy they were at home, they still took the time to comfort old Asher's wounded heart. "So we're here to attend the funeral." Gilbert stood in a remote corner in front of the door and stood shoulder to shoulder with Hanshaw and Emily, complaining with flagging interest. "No, we're here to cause trouble." Hanshaw chuckled lowly and said, "If you successfully complete the mission today, I'll reward you with a few things. Work hard." When he heard that they were here to cause trouble and that there might even be a reward tonight, Gilbert's spirits immediately rose again. He laughed heartily and wanted to walk inside, but Hanshaw grabbed him back. "Since we're here to cause trouble, of course we can't go through the front door, idiot." Hanshaw chided Gilbert with a bad temper and nodded at Emily. The three circled around and arrived at the other side of the manor where there was no one. Even some of the important corners of Asher's manor are protected by magic barriers. However, there shouldn't be any problems going through from here, but we still need to be careful. "I'll go up and take a look." Emily spoke softly and used the levitation spell that only archmages could grasp to slowly rise into the air. She landed on top of the high wall and looked around, gesturing to Hanshaw. "Can you still fly?" Hanshaw was about to move when he glanced at Gilbert and asked. Shaking his head, Gilbert said honestly, "Unless I return to my original state, I won't be able to fly over. You've become a burden from the start." Hanshaw looked at Gilbert with disdain and reached out to grab him by the neck. He used the art of the demonic ninth heavens to bring him into the air and landed next to Emily with a whoosh, landing shoulder to shoulder with Emily. The group of three flew down from the high wall, with Hanshaw and Gilbert following behind Emily. They passed through 2 corridors and a rock garden before appearing in the lively area of the manor with their usual expressions. The 3 of them had changed their clothes long before they'd arrived. Emily had smeared some magical medicine on her face and her entire appearance had changed greatly. Even Hanshaw almost didn't recognize her. The 3 of them walked into the crowd and appeared to be dressed the same as the other guests in the manor. Therefore, they didn't stand out too much and no one made trouble for them. "Wow, so many women, so many beautiful women," Gilbert was a bit excited as his eyes roamed about lecherously. He called out to Hanshaw beside him in a low voice. "Watch your image, Gilbert." Hanshaw cursed lowly as his eyes also roamed about. He suddenly saw Belinda and Johnny of the Calamity Church appear in the crowd. Lawrence, who'd changed his appearance using magical medicine, was also mixed in with the crowd. He even waved at Hanshaw when he saw Hanshaw appear. Phoebe and Candace had been arranged by Emily to stay in another place. If the Calamity Church made a move, they would cooperate and set fire to the surroundings, planning on throwing the manor into complete chaos. Add to that the changes to the defenses of Lawrence's trusted aides, the manor's defenses would be at their most lax. Hanshaw and Emily would then take the opportunity to investigate Ash's secret room. Chapter 180. Everything proceeded smoothly according to the meticulous plan. With Lawrence's prior arrangements, the Griffin Legion had made some changes to the defenses of the manor this time. Emily used the power of the Dark Mantle to restrain 3 of the 5 Earth Knights by Bob Ash's side. Belinda and Johnny of the Calamity Church weaved through the crowd for a while before disappearing without a trace. In the distance, Lawrence signaled to Hanshaw and Gilbert, indicating that everything had been arranged. "Come, let's be careful and head to Bob Ash's secret room." Seeing that everything had been done, Hanshaw didn't linger any longer. He walked around the guests with Emily and Gilbert and headed for Bob Ash's bedroom. The path to his room should have been heavily guarded, but because Lawrence's men had made arrangements beforehand, the 3 of them seemed to have an easy time on the way. When the 3 of them stood behind an artificial mountain and looked towards Bob Ash's room from afar, they discovered that many Griffin Legion soldiers were standing in front of the door. These people had solemn expressions and were tall and well built. There was a valiant aura of having gone through many battlefields, and it was obvious that they wouldn't be easy to deal with. Lawrence said that the soldiers around Bob Ash's room are all his trusted aides. They've experienced all sorts of battles with him. All of them are fearless of death and won't listen to anyone but himself. Therefore, his trusted aides can't do anything. Hanshaw glanced at those people and explained to Emily beside him in a low voice. Nodding, Emily expressed her understanding. We of the Dark Mantle also know this. We must personally eliminate this group of people, otherwise we won't be able to enter so easily." Soldiers stood on the roofs and every window. Unless they could burrow into the ground, it would be impossible for Hanshaw and the others to avoid the eyes of these people no matter how powerful their methods were. "All right. We'll wait for a while. Whether or not the Calamity Church succeeds, the entire manor will descend into chaos when they make their move." Hanshaw considered for a while and said lowly to Emily, "Honored Master, what are we waiting for?" Gilbert looked at Hanshaw with an excited expression and lowered his voice. "Master?" Emily on the side exclaimed softly and looked at Hanshaw with great bewilderment. She then looked at Gilbert and said, "How can he be your master? Are you a slave that he bought?" Rolling his eyes at Emily with disdain, Gilbert said proudly, "You're a woman with big breasts and no brains, all right. As a legendary dark dragon of the great Black Dragon City, I, Gilbert, will never become a slave." Black Dragon City, you say you're from the Dark Dragon City of the underground world?" Emily was greatly astonished as she stared at Gilbert. "Haha, you've heard of our fame?" Gilbert was quite excited when he saw that Emily seemed to know about the Black Dragon City. He puffed out his chest and said in a deep voice, "That's right, I am the future legend of the Black Dragon City. He's not my slave, but my magical pet. Their natures are more or less the same." Hanshaw smiled faintly at the astonished Emily and explained lightly. Gilbert's face immediately fell when he heard these words. As a dark dragon, being tamed as a magical pet wasn't something to be proud of. However, this was the truth and Gilbert couldn't defend himself. He could only hang his head and sigh dejectedly, saying, "What bad luck. I was surrounded by so many people the first time I left home. Otherwise, why would I be afraid of you?" Emily hadn't quite believed it at first, but when she heard Hanshaw and Gilbert's conversation, the astonishment on her face intensified. Her bright eyes stared fixedly at Hanshaw and she asked in a trembling voice, Is he really a dark dragon? Nodding his head, Hanshaw confirmed for her with great certainty. Indeed, this stupid dragon was besieged by a large dark elf family. That dark elf family paid a terrible price and heavily injured him. I took advantage of the opportunity to take advantage of the situation. I'd planned on killing him and taking his magical crystals and the like, but he didn't have the slightest bit of a dark dragon's moral integrity and shamelessly insisted on signing a master-servant contract with me, becoming my magical pet. Hihi, dark dragons are the most evil and shameless of dragons. What moral integrity do they have? Emily was quite delighted by Hanshaw's explanation. She glanced at the unlucky Gilbert and giggled mockingly. So beautiful women can be so annoying sometimes. Gilbert was quite angry as he glared at Emily and said hatefully. Just at this moment, a sharp and piercing scream suddenly rang out. Following that, all sorts of chaotic footsteps and loud shouts suddenly erupted, mixed with the neighing of horses and the violent clashing of weapons. The Calamity Church has made their move. We still don't know why the Calamity Church wants to kill Bob Asher and what grudge they have against each other. Emily's face lit up with joy as she exclaimed lowly with excitement. Chuckling coldly, Hanshaw said sinisterly, In my opinion, whether or not the Calamity Church succeeds this time, Johnny and Belinda will be heavily injured even if they don't die. We'll capture them when the time comes and slowly interrogate them. Master, you're too treacherous and shameless. Gilbert couldn't help but exclaim lowly with excitement when he saw that Hanshaw was prepared to deal with his allies from the start. Gilbert, are you mocking me? Hanshaw frowned and flicked a glance at Gilbert, speaking coldly. Shaking his head, Gilbert hastily cried out, No, I'm praising you. Your methods are the same as my brave and wise grandfather's teachings. You've deeply grasped the essence of our dark dragon's fine traditions. Emily had just said that dark dragons were evil and shameless dragons. Hanshaw finally understood why Emily would say that after hearing Gilbert's words. However, Gilbert's praise for him was obviously cursing him as well. Before Hanshaw could teach Gilbert a lesson, several places in the chaotic manor suddenly burst into flames. All sorts of panicked shouts rang out from the already chaotic manor as the Griffin Legion guards came and went in a flurry of activity. Phoebe and Candace have also made their move. We can make our move now. Hanshaw stopped bickering with Gilbert and his expression grew solemn as he stared at the Griffin Legion soldiers surrounding Bob Asher's room. Emily's expression was also solemn. She took out her magic staff and chanted a dark magic spell in a low voice. A few black shadows that looked like demons began to silently approach the guards. The Demon Slayer Edge danced gracefully in the darkness according to Hanshaw's will, quickly flashing towards a person in front of the door. Just as the Demon Slayer Edge was about to approach and that person might discover it, Hanshaw's magical yuan abruptly exploded as the Demon Slayer Edge's slow forward speed suddenly increased. With a shrill whistle, the Demon Slayer Edge pierced through the neck of the guard who'd just woken up. Assassin! Someone sharply cried out. 7 or 8 Griffin Legion soldiers hastily raised the longswords and spears in their hands, prepared to deal with any danger that might appear at any moment. Emily's dark magic only landed on the bodies of the first 2 Griffin Legion guards, causing their bodies to split open and bleeding profusely. They collapsed limply after a while. The 5 more vigilant guards behind them released their fighting aura in time and destroyed the effects of the magic. They weren't harmed at all. Due to the arrangements of Lawrence's trusted aides, everyone else had long since retreated. No one would be able to hear them no matter how much they shouted. Therefore, after the attack, Hanshaw and the other 2 didn't continue to conceal themselves and directly charged out from the shadows. Contrary to Emily's expectations, Gilbert was the fastest. Even in human form, the strength of a dark dragon's body was still unimaginable to ordinary people. Gilbert was the first to rush out excitedly. His entire person was like a bulldozer as he grabbed the spear of the guard that Hanshaw had just killed and fiercely stabbed towards the first person. Although he was a journeyman swordsman and emitted an extraordinary fighting aura, His entire body was instantly pierced through by the spear and thrown far away to the side, dying on the spot. When his fighting aura landed on Gilbert's body, it only caused Gilbert to make a muffled grunt. It didn't cause any damage to Gilbert's physical body. Emily was obviously startled by this attack and truly acknowledged Gilbert's identity as a dark dragon. Han Shoror had long since known that this would happen and wasn't surprised at all. He slowly walked over with a calm expression, his mind controlling the Demon Slayer Edge to dance wildly and kill 2 more Griffin Legion soldiers in a dazzling pattern. The strength of these soldiers were mostly mid to advanced swordsmen and knights, which was actually quite good. Their duty was to defend this area and also to call out to more experts when they encountered an enemy. If it wasn't for the fact that Lawrence had trusted aides in the Griffin Legion and had already evacuated the surrounding troops, the first assassin shout would have been able to summon several large groups of Griffin Legion soldiers. If that really happened, Han Shoror and the other 2 would only be able to flee for their lives. The remaining 2 guards finally fell under another attack of Emily's dark magic. Han Shoror instructed Gilbert when he saw that the obstacles had been cleared, "Stay here and keep watch. Let us know if there's any movement." Han Shoror shot Emily a look after saying this, and the 2 carefully pushed open the door and walked into Bob Asher's room. Bob Asher's room was decorated in an opulent and extravagant manner. Some of the furniture and decorations within were extremely valuable. The carpet was soft and smooth, likely made from the fur of an extremely rare magical creature. The wall lamps and oil paintings in the surroundings were all priceless. This Bob Asher really knows how to enjoy life. Just from the decorations in this room, it's obvious that his income isn't clean enough. Han Shoror's eyes scanned the surroundings as he walked in and immediately opened his mouth to speak. Of course. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to live in such a place with just his status as the commander of the Griffin Legion. Emily nodded and walked directly into the room as she conversed with Han Shoror. There was a mechanism in Bob Asher's room that led directly to another secret room. This was information that the Dark Mantle had paid a great price to obtain. Han Shoror and Emily went straight to the room as soon as they entered. As soon as Ari Mealy came in, she immediately lifted the blanket on the big bed in this room. Then, she reached out and fumbled around the edge of the bed for a while. Who knew what she was fiddling with? Suddenly, a hole with a flight of stairs appeared on the bedboard in this bedroom. In the Lancelot Empire, the Dark Mantle can basically find out anything we want. Although this secret room is very well hidden, Bob Asher will bring his mistress in to flaunt his greatness, so we can still find out about the existence of this place and the way in. Emily smiled at Han Shoror and explained before going down. Nodding, Han Shoror smiled to express his understanding. Indeed, someone like Bob Asher will indeed find it hard to control his desire to flaunt. If one wants to keep a secret, one must first overcome that obstacle of their own. Let's go take a look at Bob Asher's room and see what's in there," Emily said. Han Shoror followed behind her and went deeper into the underground passageway. He suddenly heard the faint sound of breathing before he reached the bottom of the ground. "There's someone down there, be careful." Han Shoror's heart tightened as he pulled Emily and spoke softly, walking even more carefully inside. When the 2 landed on the ground, Han Shoror looked towards the source of the breathing and suddenly discovered a cage with a magical boundary. The druid Caspian was tightly bound within the cage and was looking at Han Shoror and Emily with a look of pleasant surprise. Chapter 181. It was a square cage with crackling lightning crackling around it. Caspian's hands and feet were bound by metal chains. The chains gave off an icy chill, freezing his body and making it difficult for him to even breathe. Han Shoror and Emily were both startled when they saw Caspian and quickly walked towards him. Emily only observed for a moment before saying lowly, "There's a lightning and water magical boundary set up to restrict his strength. I'll need some time to undo it." Han Shoror swept a glance at Caspian, whose hair and beard were about to freeze, and said, "My weapon is very sharp, I'm confident that I can use it to break through the cage." Shaking her head with a serious expression, Emily extended a hand to stop Han Shuo's movements. She explained, "This lightning and water magical boundary is set up very cleverly. If you don't know the technique and forcefully use the sharpness of your weapon to break through the cage, it's possible that he'll be electrocuted or frozen to death immediately." Necromancy magic was different from the other mages, and Han Shuo's understanding of magic was a bit lacking compared to Emily's. Han Shuo didn't insist on his own opinion after hearing her words and said, "All right then, you're in charge of undoing the boundary. I'll look for some evidence of Bob Asher's crimes." Han Shuo didn't look at Emily any longer after he'd finished speaking and began to carefully survey his surroundings. The secret room wasn't particularly spacious, and there were many cabinets of various sizes with many strange items on them. One of the cabinets had many shiny medals on it. There were markings on these medals that explained the meaning of each medal. These were all the various awards that Bob Asher had received in his many years in the army. These kinds of awards and medals had helped him become the commander of the Griffin Legion, a glory that he could brag about for the rest of his life. There was also a cabinet with some knight armors and weapons on it. Some of these armors and weapons were still shining, and some were obviously damaged. Below each armor and weapon was a thin piece of paper, which recorded the battle in which the armor and weapon were worn. There were also a few cabinets of various sizes, some containing ancient books, some containing obviously valuable longswords and spears, but there were no jewels or beautiful jade like Han Shuo had imagined. A person of Bob Asher's status wouldn't keep those vulgar treasures in a secret room like this. Don't even think about it. For him, wealth is no longer something he should pursue. The things here symbolize his glory and memories. They are not something gold coins can compare to. In the distance, Emily was currently dispelling the boundary that imprisoned Caspian. She unintentionally flicked a glance at Han Shuo and discovered that Han Shuo didn't seem to care about these things at all. He seemed to be a bit dispirited. She couldn't help but speak up. Han Shuo sighed dejectedly when he heard Emily's reminder. "I'd thought that there would be countless gold coins and riches in his secret room. I'd even planned on rewarding Gilbert after the mission was completed. It seems that I've been ignorant and ill-informed. Hurry up and look for other things. We need evidence that will make it hard for him to turn over a new leaf." Emily rolled her eyes at Han Shuo and urged Han Shuo. Taking a deep breath in, Han Shuo calmed his mind and quickly paced around the cabinets, carefully digging out any secrets that might exist. However, after Han Shuo had searched all the cabinets, Han Shuo still didn't find anything of value. "There doesn't seem to be anything." Han Shuo spread out his hands and said a bit helplessly when he walked up to Emily. "Wait a moment." Emily was obviously at a critical juncture at this moment. A shadowy ball of magic suddenly pressed onto the cage in her hands. Two crisp sounds rang out as the ball of magic in Emily's hands pressed onto the cage. The crackling lightning on the cage disappeared in an instant. Even Caspian, who was in the cage, was no longer shivering as much as before. "All right, I've dispelled the magical boundaries within the cage. You can use your weapon to rescue him now. Leave the matter of finding evidence to me. I've been in the Dark Mantle for so long and I'm best at this sort of work." Emily breathed out lightly and turned back to smile sweetly at Han Shuo, her body slowly moving towards the cabinets. "Thank you." Caspian's trembling body had warmed up due to the dispelling of the two magical boundaries. He trembled as he thanked Han Shuo. "Heh, I can only say that you're quite lucky to have run into us," Han Shuo said with a smile as he took out the Demon Slayer edge and held it in his hand. He infused magical yuan into it and slashed it with force. Creak. Several of the dark iron pillars of the cage were instantly broken by the Demon Slayer edge's incisive slash. Han Shuo reached out and twisted with force, pulling the iron pillars to the side. Caspian walked out from within. Caspian hurriedly stretched out his body as soon as he walked out, then exhaled 2 hot breaths of air and said to Han Shuo, "How is Angelica? Is she in danger?" "Don't worry, we asked the Battlefire mercenary band to protect her before we left. I think she'll be fine, but Angelica is very worried about you." Han Shuo turned his head to look at Emily after saying this, not asking why Caspian was imprisoned here. On the other side, Emily took out some magical device and fiddled with it. She actually opened up a secret compartment in the corner of the wall and rummaged through it, taking out a small scroll. Heh, found it. Most secret rooms have secret compartments that are concealed using space magic. Ordinary people would find it hard to discover, unless they're a space grand magus. Only then can they sense some magical pulses and remove the disguise. However, we do this too often and even have specialized magic search tools. I can sense the weakest magical pulses in this room through this little thing and obtain everything we need, Emily said proudly to Han Shaw after grasping the small scroll in her hand. So you're saying that our mission this time is complete? Han Shaw paused and then asked with a smile. Nodding, Emily was quite happy as she smiled. That's right. As long as we can leave Valen City, Bob Asher will be in big trouble this time. Dong, dong, dong. At this moment, rapid knocking sounds came from above. Han Shaw and Emily looked at each other, their expressions changing. Han Shaw said lowly, "This is Gilbert's signal. This means that someone must have discovered the changes here and is rushing over. We need to hurry up and leave this place." Emily took the lead and headed back the way they'd come after saying these words. Caspian had just come out of his cage and seemed to have yet to fully recover. His face was still deathly pale and his gait was a bit stiff. Han Shaw moved quickly to Caspian's side and grabbed him on his back, rushing out with him on his back. He followed Emily and returned to Bob Asher's bedroom. They'd just landed on the bed when they heard the sounds of fierce fighting in front of the door. Emily and Han Shaw looked at each other, Emily reaching out to touch the edge of the bed. Asher's bed returned to its original state, and the two quickly made their way outside. Gilbert stood in front of the door with a spear in his hand, fending off the attacks of several Griffin Legion soldiers. Another group of Griffin Legion soldiers were rushing over from the distance, some of them wielding longbows and arrows as they found suitable positions, already planning on taking aim at Gilbert. "My honored master, you've finally come out. I'm afraid I wouldn't have been able to hold out much longer if it had been just a bit longer." Gilbert called out loudly as he took a step back and blocked an attack with his spear when he saw Han Shaw appear. Han Shaw, Emily, and Gilbert were all masked, making it impossible to make out their appearances. It was obvious that they were up to no good. Even the great druid Caspian had been covered by a black mask before he'd been carried out by Han Shaw, making him look like a thieving thief. "Hurry up and run," Han Shaw called out softly when he saw more and more Griffin Legion soldiers converging on them. He immediately found a path to charge out before they'd formed an encirclement. The longbowmen and crossbowmen were ready at this time. Han Shaw and Emily would become live targets without any cover if they took to the skies, so they had no choice but to use some of the fake mountains and trees in the manor as cover. Gilbert didn't waste any more words and rushed out behind Han Shaw without even a nod. The entire manor was ablaze by this time, and screams rang out incessantly. Belinda and Johnny blasted through a wall with the golem that looked like a three-eyed god leading the way and also ran for their lives. Johnny had an arrow stuck in his butt and there was a pool of blood on his chest. It looked like he'd been injured. "This way." When Belinda saw Han Shaw and the others, she waved her hand with the spirit of brotherhood, indicating for Han Shaw to run with them. However, Han Shaw paid no attention to her and immediately changed directions when he saw her wave her hand. He dashed towards another wall and called out lowly, "Are you kidding? There are even more people chasing after you. Wouldn't it be suicide for me to go with you?" Chapter 182. The entire manor was in a state of chaos as the surrounding houses were set ablaze. Panicked screams rose and fell as several groups of masked men in black ran for their lives. The Griffin Legion soldiers chased after them, throwing the manor into complete chaos. "Wait for us." Just as Han Shaw, Emily, and Selina were fleeing in another direction, two slim figures in black suddenly appeared. One of them hastily called out. Han Shaw knew that this was Phoebe when he heard the voice. The other person was Candace. The two of them had been setting fire to the houses since the chaos had begun. As a fire element magical swordsman, Candace was very familiar with this sort of thing. After a while, the entire manor had been turned into a sea of flames. Behind the two of them were several squads of Griffin Legion soldiers, as well as an old man with a grave expression and an overbearing aura. He wielded a long sword that radiated with silver fighting aura. This person quickly flew over. His sharp aura caused people to not dare to look directly at him. The large sword in his hand gently swung. Wherever the silver dochi passed, all the obstacles in front of him, including some trees and rocks, were all shattered into fine powder. Even the ground that was cut by the silver dochi split open and formed many gullies. Its power was terrifying to the extreme. His clerk's master, Great Swordmaster Gabriel, "Let's get out of here quickly." Candace was anxious as she called out and rushed towards Hanshoro at an even faster speed. Gabriel's speed was exceedingly fast, far surpassing the Griffin Legion soldiers behind him. As a great swordmaster, Gabriel's strength was exceedingly frightening. Hanshoro only needed one glance to know that no one on his side could stop him in a one-on-one fight. Hanshoro's expression tensed as he saw Gabriel's speed increase and was about to catch up to Phoebe and Candace. He looked at Gilbert beside him and suddenly thought of how terrifying Gilbert was after transforming into a dark dragon. He immediately called out coldly, "Damn it, hurry up and transform." At the same time, Hanshoro's attention was unprecedentedly focused as he used his mind to control the Demon Slayer Edge, whistling fiercely as it danced towards Great Swordmaster Gabriel. Magical yuan wildly surged into the Demon Slayer Edge and exploded out with a thick demonic aura, mixed with a strange aura of scorching heat and cold. The Demon Slayer Edge whistled through the air and appeared directly in front of the Great Swordmaster Gabriel, thrusting towards him. That strange cold and heat brought with it an aura of extreme danger, causing Gabriel to be startled. Snorting coldly, Gabriel suddenly waved the long sword in his hand. A cloud of silver fireworks suddenly blossomed in the air in front of him, as if a sky full of stars had shattered into specks of starlight. Hanshoro, who was controlling the Demon Slayer Edge, suddenly felt an enormous force emanate from that ball of gorgeous silver light, tightly sucking the Demon Slayer Edge that was attempting to stab at Gabriel. An enormous force suddenly surged into the Demon Slayer Edge. Gabriel's silver fighting aura was exceedingly domineering as it crashed onto the Demon Slayer Edge, as if wanting to destroy everything in its path. The Demon Slayer Edge buzzed within the ball of silver light. This domineering force entangled the Demon Slayer Edge in an exceedingly short amount of time, mixing together with the scorching cold demonic aura created by Hanshoro's magical yuan. The demonic aura formed by the mystical glacial spellfire quickly dissipated. Cursing inwardly, Hanshoro knew that he'd only been training in demonic magic for a short period of time. No matter how wondrous his demonic magic was, a few short months of training was still no match for the fighting aura that Gabriel had painstakingly gathered over decades. It was already unimaginable that the demonic aura within the Demon Slayer Edge hadn't completely dissipated after such a short period of contact. However, because of the Demon Slayer Edge's obstruction, Gabriel's footsteps finally slowed down as he was about to catch up to Phoebe and Candace. The feeling that something was wrong was becoming more and more apparent. The Demon Slayer Edge was actually unable to retract due to the tight bindings, despite his mental summons. Hanshoro couldn't help but be greatly shocked. Thinking quickly for a moment, Hanshoro's heart tightened as he focused his mental strength and quickly chanted a magical incantation. 2 bone spears suddenly flew out and shot towards Gabriel. Emily also cast a dark magic spell in the moment that Hanshoro made his move. At the same time, Hanshoro used all his strength and the magical yuan within his body circulated wildly. He suddenly tightened his mind and took advantage of Gabriel's distraction to deal with Hanshoro and Emily's magical attacks to forcibly free the Demon Slayer Edge from the ball of silver light. Because he'd expended too much energy and the speed at which the magical yuan circulated had exceeded the limits of Hanshoro's body, Hanshoro couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. He'd already suffered minor injuries. "You're hurt, put me down. I think I've recovered." Caspian, who was on Hanshoro's back, could clearly feel Hanshoro's body tremble violently. He immediately spoke to Han when he saw that Han couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. Gabriel had already destroyed Han bone spears and Emily's dark magic in a short amount of time. A pair of cold grey eyes swept towards Han and Emily at this moment, especially when he looked at Han. He seemed to be extremely curious about Han magical yuan and the Demon Slayer edge. Han turned his head to see that Gilbert had already transformed into an enormous dark dragon. Gilbert's body covered in black scales crashed fiercely into the wall in front of Han and the others, collapsing loudly. "All of you, get on his back." Han couldn't help but be overjoyed when he saw Gilbert reveal his dark dragon form. He immediately yelled out and threw Caspian, who was on his back, far away in Gilbert's direction. Han used a gentle force when he did this. When Caspian landed on Gilbert, Caspian's momentum would be slowed down and wouldn't cause too much damage to his body. Other than Ari Mealy, who already knew Gilbert's identity, Gilbert's sudden transformation into a black dragon caused everyone here to be instantly shocked. All of them stared at the enormous Gilbert with their mouths agape, and for a moment, their brains were too slow to react. Griffin Knights, all Griffin Knights gather here. Archers, spear wielders, and those with crossbows, get ready. You can all be brave warriors to slay dragons. Gabriel's high-pitched yells suddenly rang out and traveled to the other parts of the manor. "Hurry up and get on." Han couldn't help but yell out again when he saw that Candace and Phoebe were still staring at Gilbert's enormous body with some shock. Dark dragons had always been known as the most evil and greedy of the dragon tribe. They liked to live in the dark and damp underground world, and were shameless and greedy for money. They could be considered the embodiment of evil on the surface. It was normal that Phoebe and Candace couldn't react to the sudden appearance of a dark dragon in a place like this. But when Han urged them a second time, the two girls finally recognized the relationship between this dark dragon and Han. They looked at Han in shock and flew onto Gilbert's back at the same time. Han relaxed when he saw that Emily, Candace, Phoebe, and even the druid Caspian had all leapt onto Gilbert's back. He deployed the art of the demonic ninth heavens and flew towards Gilbert as well. He instructed, "Leave immediately, but don't fly high into the air or you'll become a target. Esteemed master, please help me block the arrows and spears that are shot at me." Gilbert's mouth was now filled with sharp teeth, and the draconic breath he exhaled carried a strong pungent odor. His voice also seemed a bit more dignified than before. "I know. This place is a mess anyways. If there's anyone in your way, destroy them all. You don't have to worry about anything else as long as we can escape this place." Han didn't give the dark dragon any restraints at all when he heard Han instructions. Caspian seemed to feel a bit bad when he heard Han instructions, but when he thought of how Han had already helped him many times and that Han was also thinking about the lives of his group, he moved his lips but didn't say anything in the end. "Waha, all right then, I won't hold back," Gilbert cheered excitedly amidst his dignified voice. A stream of acidic venom suddenly sprayed out from its fanged maw into the distance. The Griffin Legion archers who'd just gotten into formation all retreated in panic as soon as this dragon breath containing acidic venom shot out. Those who didn't dodge in time had their skin and flesh fester in the blink of an eye after being touched by the acidic venom. It looked like only death awaited them. Dozens of Griffin Knights suddenly appeared in the distance after the dragon breath shot out. They all wielded long silver spears and wore shining silver armor as they flew over on their griffins. The person at the front had a sturdy body and didn't look young. Silver fighting aura shot out from the tip of the spear, making the silver spear with all sorts of complicated patterns seem even longer and narrower. "Hurry, Bob Asher is here. It looks like the Calamity Church has indeed failed." Han turned pale with fright when he saw that the dark dragon still wanted to act arrogantly. He stomped on the dark dragon's body and hastily gave the order. "You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories,